Hello everyone, welcome back to another stream. Nice to have you all in. Zelda here, nice to see you again. Marcharave, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but welcome in. Necropolis, nice to see you again. Yeah, I'm doing pretty well, hope you guys are too. So yesterday we watched a couple videos by Eridan talking about the Witch of Izalith and Pyromancy, and they were pretty good. We also finished off with a video from Channel Yoshimitsu with lore video of Seath the Scaleless and the identity of his daughter. Spoiler alert, he thinks it's Rosaria. I disagree, and I think it's Priscilla, but it was a fun video nonetheless. So today, I figured we'll do something a bit different and watch a video about the story of Demon Souls lore. I've played through Demon Souls twice. Once was on stream. I'm not super familiar with its lore, which, I mean, it doesn't really have a lore, so maybe I'm kind of lying by saying that. But anyway, curious to see what he pieces together, if he could give me a fuller understanding and a better appreciation of the game. So looking forward to that one. And then after that, we have a video by SolePorpoise in saying goodbye to Souls games. So I know it's a little bit of a clickbaity title, but it says the critics are wrong right here. So I figure it's probably about like Elden Ring's differences, because I saw like the first 10 seconds when I was like looking for videos to add to the list. And so I figured let's start off with Demon Souls and end off with like Elden Ring and more critical stuff. So a little bit of a difference in content. So anyway, more lore than there seems. Mercy, Elden Enthusiast, nice to have all of you guys again. You are quite the Demon Souls connoisseur, you'd like to believe, so you should have quite a lot to say this time. Nice. It does have lore. I didn't say it didn't have lore, I just said like it doesn't really have like a lot, especially in comparison to the more recent titles. So I take back nothing. Good day, sir. Alright, so let's go ahead and dive on into AesirAesthetics, exploring the story of Demon Souls. Hey Artur Shinzak, welcome in. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly.
Sure.
Sorry, my double speed habits again getting ahead of us. Alright, and let me know how the volume is, because I had to like switch a lot of stuff around yesterday. In terms of like my audio as well as the videos. Here we go. Spoiler warning.
Surely you have seen for yourself the pain and suffering that fills this world. But fight poison with poison. God is merciful, and so created the Old One. The Old One will feed on our souls and put an end to our tragic realm of existence. You fool! Don't you understand? No one wishes to go on.
King Allant XII was once a magnanimous and beloved ruler who cared deeply for his subjects and fought valiantly to destroy the demons remaining from the first scourge. With time, however, Allant became melancholy, and in his pursuit of power for himself and the kingdom he ruled over, he eventually made his way to the Nexus and learned about the ancient and forgotten Soul Arts. With the knowledge of the Soul Arts, King Allant left the Nexus and ushered in an age of unprecedented prosperity for Boletaria. However, with time, the suffering of the world around him began to weigh on him, and he chose to take matters into his own hands.
I have had enough of this rotten world.
He returned to the Nexus and awoke the Old One, an ancient poison upon the soul created by God to cleanse the earth. And thus, King Allant began the Second Scourge. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where our story, the story of the Slayer of Demons, begins. With the world covered by a colorless deep fog and demons feeding on the souls of humanity for the second time. The first time this happened, the destruction was indescribable. Here's how the Last Monumental describes it.
So more lore says there's a lot of assumptions already. I'll be honest, I was a little bit spaced out because I was like annoyed how my chat was failing me and stuff. So I might have missed a thing or two, but it didn't seem too bad from what I was hearing. Where did they get the Allant the 12th was there for the first Scourge? Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know why the chat is getting errors, at least for me. The funny thing is, I know you guys can see it in the chat that I have on my stream going right now, so that's kind of ironic. But anyway, yeah, so is the current Alant the 12th one, or was there another one? Maybe there's like an item that says it or something like that? Or maybe like an interview. But yeah, if you have more info, feel free to let me know.
In the distant
Okay,
past,
okay. Current one is 12th.
under a benevolent rule, the world was united owing to the soul arts. Until a lust for power caused the awakening of the Old One. Across the land seeped a colorless, deep fog, and the world faced extinction at the hands of the demons. Thanks be, we were able to lull the Old One back to his slumber, yet only after the loss of innumerable souls, and half the world lost, erased by the fog. In order to mend the fabric of what land still remained, we entrusted 6 elders with 6 precious archstones. 1 to the king of a small yet diligent land. 1 to the king of the burrowers underground. 1 to the wise queen of the great ivory tower. 1 to the chieftain of lost and ill-fortuned souls. 1 to the shaman of the tempest-worshipping shadowmen.
These auto subs or something else. Like they use the Pokemon spelling of shaman. So if I press C, will this make them go away? Okay, I'll just need to remember that and like manually turn off subs or closed captions when we've got like the actual subs going. This intro is one of your favorite in the whole series. Yeah, the Demon Souls intro is really good. The Demon Souls soundtrack is also really good, and that's kind of one thing that I lament about like the later Souls games is that pretty much all of their music went from being this kind of more atmospherically fitting stuff that you get in Demon Souls to just more or less being boss music and then like super loud and bombastic. Morlor says, you think they assume that the king of a small yet diligent land is Lot the 12th maybe? But that doesn't really make sense timeline-wise. If anything, it makes more sense that it'd be Doran. Yeah, old King Doran. True. Yeah, because I was thinking about that as well. So maybe they were thinking Alant must have seen the last one once he like traveled across the fog, maybe? Because he comes back with the demon or the old one. So yeah, I don't know what his thoughts were there. I should have paid a bit more attention to the intro. That's my fault. Oh, it could be his assumed name? Interesting. Yeah, I could see what you mean with that. Shaman, like the Pokemon here. Right, here we go.
And the last to the great giants of the northern lands. The archstones were placed at nodes across the earth. We contained the Old One inside this nexus and banned the soul arts. Finally, we became monumentals, half-living sentinels of the fabric of reality.
Hey guys, it's the Erd Tree.
The other monumentals have perished, and only I remain.
Those 6 archstones connect the world and allow the Slayer of Demons passage across the land. Great demons reside in each world, and only after destroying every demon will the Slayer of Demons be granted an audience with the Old One. It will howl, beckoning for a new servant, which is when the Maiden in Black, a great demon which resides in the Nexus and binds the power of hostless souls to the Slayer of Demons, is meant to lull the Old One back to slumber. But the demons are not easy prey. Before facing them, the Slayer of Demons must make their way across the ruined lands and face death over and over again. After they traversed the fog and came to Boletaria, they died and were bound to the Nexus. This ensured that their souls would not become transient and that their mind would not break. They will live on in soul form after their bodies die to traverse the distorted worlds and uncover the dark secrets they hold.
At its peak, Boletaria was a grand kingdom. The king, his knights, and his subjects were modest and plain, but also steadfast and compassionate. In the distant southern kingdom, Boletaria was known as paradise on earth. But look at what has become of us now. I refuse to believe that this is what Father wished for our great land.
The second scourge has been rough on Boletaria. The once noble knights have become demons, and the only citizen we meet who's maintained his sanity is the Dregling merchant, a morally shaky sort who sells what he loots of the dead. King Alant's son, Ariona Alant, traveled to Boletaria under the alias Ostrava to uncover...
Does anybody know if that's the same Dregling throughout Boletaria? Because if you kill him there, does he not show up in the other locations? Because that's something that I meant to test out, and I just kind of never got around to it, I don't think.
Cover whether there were truths to the rumors that his father had become a demon. He is speculated to have been staying in Latria with his uncle Lord Ridiel, also known as Little Alant, before arriving. He wears the fluted armor set and wields the rune weapon set. These can all be found in Latria, and the fluted set mentions that it was crafted in the south. Additionally, Ostrava gifts the Slayer of Demons a telescope which also comes from the south. It's from Ostrava that we can uncover most of what we know about the history of Boletaria.
Alright, so it is the same Dregling thing.
With a round table of brave knights. The royal twin fangs, Valafax and Bjor. Alfred, the Knight of the Tower. Metas, the Knight of the Lance. And the brave tribesman Longbow Ulan and his fearsome legions. But today, Boletaria is an abysmal mess. Valafax was lost, and Bjor slipped through the fissure, never to be heard from again. All the rest, along with Boletaria, have been devoured by the fog.
I legitimately don't remember if I got that dialogue from him. I might have, I just don't remember Demon Souls that well.
And will soon be prey to the demons. The Boletarian Knights are no longer. But perhaps our age will see the rise of new heroes, such as yourself.
After the arrival of the demons, Valorfax became lost as he escaped the fog and warned the world of the terrors facing Boletaria. His fate is unknown, but there are some theories worth looking into. Valorfax and Bjor make up the elite duo, the Twin Fangs, and if we assume that they wear the same armor set, then he might have been murdered by Executioner Meralda, as the brushwood set is found near her. Alternatively, Bjor is also known to wear the Ring of Great Strength, and we can find a copy of this ring on a corpse near the blue and red dragons. Bjor himself was captured after falling through the fissure and thrown in a dungeon, wardened by a fat minister. Like Ostrava, he holds on to the hope that King Alant could not be the cause of the demon scourge, and like Ostrava, he comes to accept the truth in the end. Unlike Ostrava, however, he does not commit suicide at the knowledge. After aiding the Slayer of Demons in killing the Blue Dragon, thus possibly avenging Valorfax, Bjor and the Slayer of Demons will talk for the last time, and keen-eared listeners will note that his dialogue sounds pained near the end. That and his retreat back to his cell suggests that he's given up the fight.
Oh yeah, I didn't know he went back to his cell. Or maybe I did it on stream. I don't remember. But yeah, that's some cool info. So more lore says that the demon bosses in World 1 could also just be the super copies like we get with the False King Alant. Maybe. I don't know, because at least with False King Alant, his name is kind of more along the lines of like Avatar Alant, if I'm remembering correctly, at least from the Japanese text of the game. So the other demons seem to be a bit more corporeal. I don't know how we could separate them. And if so, I guess that like calls into question all the other demons we fight. The organ goes hard. Yeah, I was enjoying it. Ostrava doesn't really kill himself, rather he dies from his wounds. I thought... Maybe, okay. It's unclear if Ostrava commits suicide or dies to his wounds. Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you guys.
On the steps to the false king, the slayer of demons meets Ostrava for the final time. Overcome with despair at the knowledge that his father has become a demon, Ostrava will commit suicide after gifting to the slayer the mausoleum key. Ostrava...
Yeah, I feel like that's a little bit strong based off that animation there specifically. I mean, he's obviously kind of like broken-hearted, which, like, if you look at the other Souls games, when people lose their purpose, they kind of just up and stop existing anymore. So maybe it's a kind of a fanciful suicide or something like that. Yeah, he kind of let himself die there. We do fight Red Phantoms of the Three Knights as Red Phantoms after the Penetrator. True. Yeah, I guess I can see what you mean about that with, like, the copies. Yeah, that makes sense.
Made it much farther than anyone would reasonably expect him to, largely because of the assistance the Slayer of Demons granted him, and the Mausoleum Key might be Ostrava's way of paying the Slayer back. This Agalmatolite key opens up the royal family mausoleum where the legendary twin swords are kept, under the safeguard of Old King Doran. Old King Doran is a demigod who founded Boletaria and now serves as a protector of the royal family and the aforementioned twin swords, the Demon Brand and the Soul Brand. The former banishing that which befouls man, and the latter banishing man himself. Only the Demon Brand is kept in the mausoleum, as King Alant wielded the Soul Brand when he had his audience with the Old One. Old King Doran will gift the Slayer the Demon Brand after they prove their mettle in combat against him, and the Soul Brand they may find with the true King Alant near the game's end. Should they...
The feels when this dude is tougher than the final boss in the game. It's kind of cool to think everyone got replaced by the demon copycats, while the Knights became Dark Phantoms and Halan became a slug. Oh, Alant became a slug. We always figured the bosses we fight were copies like the False King Alant. The reason False King is a human enough... I don't know what FK is. I'm assuming False King is human enough is to fool his son. Maybe because he embraced the Old One, whereas the others were enslaved. Maybe.
They make their way to Stonefang, they can force from these two swords the unity weapon Northern Regalia. An ancient weapon said to have been left in the world around the same time as the Old One itself was, and for vague, malicious purposes. Much of the Demon Souls experience is very vague and malicious, like the Fat Ministers. Exactly what they are and how much agency they have over their actions and what roles they play is up for debate, but they are definitely the bad guys. It seems that they have a natural affinity for torture and debaucherous conduct, as is seen with the way they often are shown to lead the mad, soulless humans in the world, and in how they seem to take joy in harming those they imprison. Yoria is alluded to having been raped, Bjor is kept out of the fight, Ridial is imprisoned in soul form, etc. The humans which the Fat Ministers oversee lack clear mind. The game's menu cinematic establishes that the soul is what gives human beings the power of clarity, and as the demon scourge is eating the souls of men, all that remains are mad husks, who grow soul-starved and violent. They are naturally attracted to those with souls, and can otherwise not function in any capacity other than what the Fat Ministers dictate.
So is Riddell actually imprisoned by a fat official? Because I don't remember any of the officials in Tower Latria.
To them. Stonefang Tunnel is an excavation site formerly, and likely currently, under the control of King Alant. Its upper levels are inhabited mostly by miners and Fat Ministers, but we can also encounter the Filthy Man, Patches the Hyena, and Blacksmith Ed here. The filthy man takes advantage of the miners' lack of clear mind by stealing their excavations and selling them. He is somewhat familiar with the interior of Stonefang as he knows about the lair of the crystal lizards, but it's clear he doesn't want to dive too deep, likely because of the rumored inhabitants of the deep. Patches, the hyena, is a From Software staple, and just like in the other games, he's a malicious individual who lures unsuspecting victims to their death so that he can loot their corpses later. In Demon's Souls, we see many insane humans who exist solely to feed off the souls of the living, and we also see seemingly sane individuals who function much the same. Otherwise normal humans who give in to their lower nature and turn against their fellow man when really they ought to unite against the common enemy they face in the demons. The miners in Stonefang have all lost their sanity long ago and exist solely to be supervised by the fat ministers in mining ore, which is used to forge weapons for the Boletarian army. The miners are beginning to scale over from their intense exposure to the elements, but this is not necessarily representative of losing their souls or becoming demons. In Stonefang, we can find the most accomplished blacksmith in the game, Blacksmith Ed, who along with his twin brother Baldwin also showcases this scalification. In the Nexus, the Slayer of Demons is aided in their blacksmithing needs.
I didn't know they had scales on them. I mean, that might also be like a remake thing, but I guess I didn't look at them super closely. Maybe I should like try to take advantage of that photo mode or something.
By Baldwin, and they can learn from him that as a young man, he would clear out beer bugs from the mine tunnels with his bare hands. These beer bugs and other tough creatures still live deep in the mines where the expansion of the industrial mining apparatus has stopped. I imagine that in the past, Stonefang was not as extensively mechanized as it is right now, so having a strong guy like Baldwin to clear out the beer bugs would have been a good thing. Even so, Baldwin admits that his strength is no match for Ed's. Ed will craft for the Slayer of Demons weapons from Demon's Souls, and has much to say about the nature of blacksmithing. It might be a good thing that the Slayer of Demons meets him when they do, as Ed is so consumed by his work that he might soon become indistinguishable from the mindless humans who slave away mining ore here. Both Ed and Baldwin carry a Hand of God which were once worn by the legendary Big M, a figure of some note as he killed dragons with his bare hands. I've come to believe that the Flamelurker demon and the legendary Big M are one and the same, and I also believe that he is the ancestor of Ed and Baldwin. Outside of the Flamelurker boss room, we...
That's interesting. I don't know how I feel about that. No, they're called bear bugs. Yeah, I mean, he doesn't sound like a native speaker of English, perhaps. Maybe he's a native speaker, but at least he doesn't sound like American or Australian or like British or something like that. So I think it's just more of like an accent thing. Big M is Flamelurker's extremely popular theory. The Descendants thing is something you haven't heard of before, though. Yeah, that was the thing that I was a little bit confused by. But I mean, I don't really have anything to say against it. The subtitles are saying beer bugs. Yeah, it's because the subtitles are auto-generated. So, yeah, if they had ever uploaded their own subtitles, it'd probably be correct. That was throwing you off too? Okay. Here we go.
You can find 2 Hands of God, and the Flamelurker boss room is filled with the corpses of dragons. Additionally, the Flamelurker's face seems designed to evoke the glasses worn by Adam Baldwin, and like the legendary Big M, the Flamelurker fights exclusively with his hands. This boss...
That's a cool theory right there with the hands, but I just wanted to point out how much I appreciated their freaking halberd was clipping through my man's face in their exposition here.
The Flamelurker fights exclusively with his hands. This boss makes very little narrative sense if he's not the legendary Big M, and it otherwise doesn't quite add up why Ed requires his soul specifically to forge for the slayer of demons weapons from demons' souls. Whether or not the legendary Big M was transformed into the Flame Lurker, or whether the Flame Lurker is a manifestation of the legend of the legendary Big M is unknown, but what we do know is that the Flame Lurker protects the entryway to a holy site. Skurver the Wanderer is the area's great lore master, and it's from his dialogue and its inferences that we can puzzle together the Stonefang mystery. Long ago, this mountain was inhabited by burrowers who believed that the dragon skeleton deep inside was a god who transformed dragon bones into ore. They also feared that this skeleton might one day return to life, so they built a temple to it to seal it in as well as to appease it. But they also constructed 2 countermeasures should the thing ever return and be hostile. The first countermeasure are the 2 harpoon ballistas aimed directly at it, and the other countermeasure is an item which Skurver very much wants to see: the legendary dragon bones. Latria is the first of 2 areas meant to communicate the idea of evil, and this area is a mirror to human evil. But it didn't used to be. Once, this dungeon was an ivory tower, and this land was ruled over by a wise and adored queen and her husband. That husband had a depraved nature, though, so the queen eventually saw fit to eject him from her kingdom, but he returned one day, clad in yellow garb with an army of demons in tow. After murdering the queen and solidifying his control over the region, he set about to systematically transform this land into a shrine to evil. He imprisoned the civilians and royals alike in dungeons filled with torture devices and wardened by an army of mind flayers. We know the prisoners are former royals because we can meet the once royal mistress, and because the generic prisoner drops are items which allude to having been exclusively owned by the affluent. They also drop shards of mercury stone, implying that mercury may have been used to fry their brains. And it might be that the mercury was given to them. Silver is said to have healing and protective qualities in this game, and it might be that the prisoners were given mercury and told it was silver. So as they clutched on to the hope for protection, their minds were being rotted.
I like that theory right there. So you guys are talking about there being a potential of there being 2 dragon gods. I'm curious as to your source for that, although you said you forgot what it was. So Marcha Rave says it might be like the first one you fight if you complete the tutorial, I'm assuming. Yeah, that would be my first guess, but aside from that, if you think of like the real dragon god that got killed, that could potentially be one, versus the thing that got resurrected could just be like a recreation due to the faith of the people who once lived in that area. You don't know where he's getting the love thing? Why could the old monk have been an advisor? Why couldn't the old monk have been an advisor or whatever? If he has a source for husband, you'd like to see it. I think there was supposed to be something that implied a more romantic thing, but I honestly don't remember. You remember him being her husband clearly, but you don't remember the source? Okay. At the very least, it's like, why could he get all the way up to the throne room? I think there might have been something in like the paintings up there, but I could be wrong very easily.
The mind flayers are the octopus-headed monsters which have a knack for incapacitating those who would wander through these halls. Not all prisoners here are in fact soul-starved or insane. There's the aforementioned once royal mistress, and there is also Sage Frake, who will teach the Slayer of Demons magic, Yurt, the Silent Chief, who will teach the Slayer of Demons the folly of trust, and finally, Lord Ridiel is imprisoned in soul form.
I love that he just said he would teach you the folly of trust. How well said, yet so vague. The dragon god at the tutorial looks different, you think, but you might be wrong? Okay. Yeah, he was definitely close to the queen, the yellow monk, or whatever you want to call him.
Ridial's imprisonment seems especially cruel in that he is not allowed to leave even in death, and some speculate that this is because he was the new husband of the Queen of Latria, and that the old monk harbors a peculiar grudge against him. Sage Frake was imprisoned after being overpowered by the old monk, and Yurt was in Latria, likely on official business. Latria contains numerous items which hint to a secretive soul society who seek to eradicate the knowledge of the soul arts, and Yurt is working for Mephistopheles to do just that. Who captured him is unknown, but he is aware of the Slayer of Demons, as he notes in Death that Mephistopheles was right about them, and is seen by him having the foreknowledge to lie that he is also killing demons, and thus he should be freed from his cell. It's clear that the old monk is indeed powerful, that he was able to capture all of these individuals, and his power is probably in manipulating souls. It's possible that the vaguely described depravity of the old monk was that he was in fact a member of the secret soul society. The prevailing theory is that they traffic in the harvesting of souls, which might explain why the old monk has such immense knowledge of them. The Queen of Latria was murdered in secrecy, and to quell all hope for insurrection, the king created a doll in the queen's image. She's located in a church whose access is closed off by an enormous ballista in the queen's likeness, which slaughters those that would attempt to enter. But rumors spun by the old monk himself insist that the queen can offer salvation to the truly faithful and help them ascend. This is a particular type of cruelty, to offer hope where none exists, and to top it off, the ascension by angels is in fact just a descent to a deeper level of despair. The first archstone is cradled by a dead prisoner clinging to hope, but the second one has nobody, because those who make their way to the upper level are transformed into horrible monsters by the.
So more lore says you don't know where he gets the idea that the queen was murdered, but it does seem to be like a reasonable assumption. So yeah, I think that's also a reasonable assumption. I don't know if it was ever made explicit, but certainly like the queen is no longer in power, and it does kind of make sense for the false idol to have been made in her image, perhaps, but I don't know enough about Demon Souls to say whether or not that's true. She says the king was banished and returned in yellow garb. Who says that? Is that the noble lady Astynex? And Astynex, Beans and Rice, and was it Grace that I saw earlier? Anyway, everybody, welcome on in. Nice to see you all again. Alright, so let's go back to the video.
Old monk. Before fighting the man-eaters, the Slayer of Demons must collapse what appears to be an enormous heart, which the old monk used to fabricate his monsters. It's theorized that the souls of those in the prison are farmed to feed this enormous organ, and the area it hovers over might have been the meeting ground for the Soul Society before Latria's collapse. The man-eaters are twin demons who guard the bridge to the old monk, and seem to have been created from a single human being, as there's a corpse nearby which can be looted for 2 souls. These demons can cast the same Wrath of God-esque explosion magic, although Wrath of
Was that different in the remake? I don't remember the corpse having their 2 souls, but I could be wrong.
God is a miracle, foreshadowing, that the Mind Flayers could cast, and they have snakes for tails, which will often bite their host and cause them great anguish. Another showcase of the old monk's cruelty in that he would make suffer even those who serve him completely. After venturing through the terrible land, the Slayer of Demons will not come face to face with the old monk, as the old monk himself has been drained and transformed into nothing more than an insane vessel to the yellow garb. This garb will search out for humans to take over and have them fight the Slayer instead. The insanity catalyst is created from this demon's soul, and it reads, a catalyst wrapped in golden cloth, forged from the soul of the demon old monk. It causes insanity in the wielder and drastically increases the strength of spells, but halves the wielder's maximum MP. If you have no dreams for the future, you may want to place your trust in the power of the Golden Garb. MP scales with the intelligence stat, so in splitting the MP in half, the insanity catalyst ludonarratively causes the wielder madness. There's a level of despair telatria unmatched in any subsequent FromSoft game in the all-too-human suffering for all-too-human reasons. Heavy is the head which wears the crown, and the Yellow Garb's incredible powers can be yours for the small price of induced madness.
And then, of course, this thing comes back up in the Xanthus Scholar set in the Dark Souls series, which comes like a nod towards this, which is kind of funny because in Dark Souls 1, it's more like a bulb on the top of the head, but then in Dark Souls 3, it's more like this one, which kind of looks more like a mushroom and is kind of supposed to be more reminiscent of Elizabeth from Ulasil, but anyway, that's not too important. Astynex did find a quote that says, "The queen banished her depraved old man from the land. He returned in strange golden garb with foul demons in tow." Okay, thank you. I'm kind of curious about the Japanese for that. I would need to really look into it because there's not a lot of good resources for that. But anyway. The Once Royal Mistress. Oh, and that came from the Once Royal Mistress. Okay, thank you. And you guys don't remember the stuff about the heart. Yeah, the cloth itself is the demon, correct. That's the monkey paw with a timer, a little bit. Oh, chat's being bad for you guys too? Yeah, that's really weird. It's giving me issues. Okay, here we go.
The Shrine of Storms rests on the island of the elusive Shadowman, shaman who worshipped the storm and mourned those that die. It's a very ethereal plane, and not quite compatible with any traditional fantasy setting. In the shrine, legends have been brought to life by the Old One, which might be why it's attracted those human beings we can find here. The man Satsuki, whose clothing indicates he came from the Valley of Defilement, searches for the magic sword Makoto, a cursed weapon named after a giant which allegedly belonged to Satsuki's father. It's an interesting weapon in that it slowly kills the wielder and inflicts wounds that are said to never heal. In the end of his questline, Satsuki will attempt to murder the Slayer of Demons. With the Makoto if the Slayer hands it over to him, with the hiltless katana if the Slayer kept the Makoto for themselves. The hiltless is also wielded by the Black Phantom, who resides with Saint Urbane in the trap. Patches overseas. Patches is up to his old tricks again, and this time has captured the Saint Urbane, a miracle man who is said to hear the voice of God. Another human being which can be found here in a trap laid out by Patches is Grave Robber Blige. He's a scavenger like Patches, and after the Slayer of Demons saves him from a cell, he will serve as a very useful vendor. Like the Draggling Merchant and Patches himself, the items he sells were all scavenged, and he himself serves to fill in much of the lore about this place. It's thanks to him that we know that the Shadowmen who once inhabited this island are long gone. Him and, just looking around, not seeing anybody. The Shadowmen are about as elusive as the ancient Stonefang burrowers, so not much is known about them, but we can surmise from the information the game gives that they were probably tall, pagan barbarians who believed in cutting their lips off. They believed that dark rituals could appease the storm beasts and bring rain. Those who died...
Do you guys know where he's saying they probably believed in cutting their lips off? At the very least, it's not from this description.
Who believed in cutting their lips off.
I wonder if it's just because of their appearance.
They believed that dark rituals could appease the storm beasts and bring rain. Those who died were said to be met by the adjudicator, who judged whether their souls were worthy of proceeding to the next phase of the ritual, or whether they would simply be devoured by the adjudicator itself. Those deemed worthy would...
The adjudicator is just so goofy looking in the original. Not that he's like much better in the remake. He kind of looks like Crumb from Real Monsters, if anybody knows that show. You think he's getting it from the visual? Okay. What? Okay, cool computer. You think you read that one? It's the ancient hero face, and their Arkstone also has some item description. Okay, so the Arkstone. Patches is the only character to travel between Arkstones. Just a fun fact. Wait, how do you explain like all of the other ones being able to get back to the Nexus then? Oh, you mean like literally between like World 2 and like World 4. Okay, that makes sense.
Be laying out on a shrine overlooked by the body of the old hero during a storm to be mourned by the tribe. Finally, the remains of these heroes of storms would be offered up for consumption to the Storm King, who hovers over a valley littered with stone monoliths. These pagan myths have been brought to life by the Old One, and now the Slayer of Demons makes their way through the ceremony to eradicate the skeletons who have been given life by wandering souls and the demons which reside here. The first one being the Adjudicator, who also has his lips torn off and is seemingly impaled with the tip of one of his large cleavers. The bird judges, and the swollen demon Adjudicator devours. On the path to the old hero, the Slayer of Demons can find a very strange room, filled with narrow walkways, some sort of soul water and snails. These snails are attracted to the magical powers which the transient souls have gifted the water, and their slime trails are the sticky white stuff which we can find all over the game, which gives our weapons magic buffs. The old hero is a blind demon who in legend was a towering figure. Like all other figures of the Shadowmen, his lips are torn off and his power seems to have been luck. We don't know what his tail was, I have theories, but his soul creates the large sword of searching, a worn and thoroughly used blade which doubles drop rates. Drop rate is connected to the luck stat like MP is to intelligence, so again, we have lore and ludonarrative. Miracles in this game are countersigns to the power of demons, and the old hero's soul can be transformed into the second chance miracle. It revives the caster from death and is a countersign to the pagans who worshipped death and the dead. The old hero is also referred to as the Searcher of Storms, so I figure, because his soul is connected to fortune and discovery, that in legend he found this area. He discovered the storm beasts, he found the storm he was searching for. The final demon of the area is the Storm King, which is the largest of the sadistic, manta-ray-like storm beasts. These feast on the souls of the deceased, so it has been theorized that the Reapers are killing them to create these shadow lurkers. This would explain why so many of them lay dead near the shrine. The storm beasts bring from the sky Cloudstone, which is a rare ore.
I'm gonna need to rewatch that. Wait, what did he say?
Manta-ray-like storm beasts. These feast on the souls of the deceased, so it has been theorized that the Reapers are killing them to create these shadow lurkers. This would...
Okay, so the black dudes on the inside kill them to make like the super tall ghostly boys, I think. That's kind of weird to me. I thought these things were kind of like the souls of the lost tribe when they got like sent out there, I guess. But I don't know. All right. The fact that the hero was in the wall may hint to his body being mummified and entombed, being animated by the fog. Yeah, potentially. Rykard -1, -1. Yeah. So this is obviously like the very first instance of the Storm Ruler fight. We do get a pretty good version in Dark Souls 3 with Yor and Sigvard.
Explain why so many of them lay dead near the shrine. The storm beasts bring from the sky Cloudstone, which is a rare ore. although probably this is a myth, and the Cloudstone is just part of their anatomy. It's a rare ore because storm beasts are not easy prey. Thankfully, however, there exists a weapon powerful enough to rend the sky and bring these Titans of the Tempest down. The legendary Storm Ruler. The Valley of Defilement is the other level meant to be a place of evil. Unlike Latria, however, this evil is made of nature, not man. The valley was the dumping ground for the rest of the world. This is where all things unwanted, the diseased, the old, or the young.
This is the gutter 1.0. Or like 0.0, 0.01, something like that.
In the case of the aborted children, came to reside. This land was filthy and unholy and thus attracted the attention of the holy warriors of the West, wielding the revelations from God. Like the secret soul society, these holy warriors exist mostly in lore and item description, but the information on them is comparatively staggering.
Every time he says Soul Society, my mind like immediately jumps to Bleach, and I think of like all the Shinigami and stuff. Yeah, the first swamp. There might have been swamps in like Kingsfield. I don't actually know if it's like the first one, but yeah, definitely the most memorable one, perhaps.
Astrea and the Vinland family are from the Western Highlands, which is theorized to be the operational base for the Church of Boletaria. This church has ranks for its members, and we know of two characters who serve as spiritual leaders, Saint Urbane and Father Vinland. Below them are holy knights, and in this rank we can find Celine Vinland, Vito or Bito, the Moonlight Knight, who has two names in this game because Japanese is wonky with its B's and V's, and there was a translation issue. We'll call him Vito. There's also Rizaya, or Lizaya.
Oh yeah, and her name is Selin, like in Elden Ring, so it's just kind of funny to me how often they recycled the names. Yulia or Yuria comes up in Demon Souls. Technically, it also comes up in Dark Souls 1, because the merchant in the Undead Burg will also call for Yulia, like his invisible cat, or whatever you want to think it is. And obviously, Yuria shows up in Dark Souls 3. Wait, I always confuse Yuria with Carla. Is there another Yuria in Dark Souls 3? Maybe not. I'm just losing my mind. I don't know. What did I do to my chat? Okay. Oh, yeah. Enfia was going to be Yuria. That's true. You wish he would give more sources for his words? Yeah, that could be some pretty constructive feedback in terms of, like, having... Ooh, crap, what did I just do? Where were we? We were obviously over here. Yeah, okay. What was I saying? That's weird. Yeah, if he had some sources like on like a corner of the screen where he was like making his references to, that would be top tier. The lasagna, the priestess. Is that what the auto thing said? Rezaya? Oh, wow. We'll call him Vito. There's also Rezayan or lasagna in Japanese. I hate Mondays.
Japanese is also funny with ours and else. We'll call her Rizaya of Istarel, and formerly Garl Vinland. Assumably in the same rank was Maiden Astrea before she and Garl left, and there are also Temple Knights, dressed in a white Myrden armor, Myrd being a long-lost land where the first temples were built, which might actually be the Valley of Defilement itself. There were priests who spread the holy word and can take up arms as infantry, and finally there were basic acolytes, mostly untrained but devoted human beings who assisted in religious ceremonies and act as personal servants to higher level clerics. These holy warriors ventured to the Valley of Defilement, and most never came back. Rizaya is very likely dead, as we can find her revelation from God. The spear Istarel, which protected Rizaya from poison and the plague, near 3 giant depraved ones, and is likely that her corpse fell down into the lair of the Leechmonger, a giant mass of blood-sucking leeches which was seemingly assembled by the power of a demon's soul.
Yeah, I don't remember that character at all. Not the Leechmonger, although that one's barely memorable, to be honest. Other than it being weak to fire. Yeah. But I'm assuming it's like Rosaria? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Vito, the Moonlight Knight's revelation from God, was the large sword of moonlight, a powerful sword composed of pure light, able to cut through any shield and requiring immense faith from its wielder. Vito, the toxic stagger knight, might therefore be a more apt name. The large sword of moonlight can be found covered in slugs, who seem to be attracted to its power, like the slugs in the Shrine of Storms, who created the sticky white stuff. Near this sword, we can find a corpse carrying a legendary hero's soul, which we can assume to be Vito himself, or herself, as nearby there's a giant slug who drops the dull gold armor, which is exclusively wearable by women. Also found in the Valley of Defilement prior to fighting the Dirty Colossus is Celine Vinland, Garl's sister, who is searching for her brother to deliver to him the final words of their recently deceased father, as well as his old ring, the Ring of Devout Prayer. Side note, it's because this ring signifies high ranking with the Church that it can be surmised that Father Vinland was of comparable rank to Saint Urbane. Before facing Garl Vinland and Maiden Estrella, the Slayer of Demons must destroy the Dirty Colossus, which is seemingly an amalgamation of all the filth of the valley. Garl Vinland blocks the narrow path which leads to Maiden Estrella. His armor is made of dark silver, which is an ancient metal set to purify dark malice, and he wields the brand, whose distortion is the mark of a giant slayer. Unlike the magic sword Makoto, the giants referred to here are likely the giants of the Lost Archstone. The brand is not referred to as a revelation from God, but it does share the Isturel's protective powers. After killing Garl, the Slayer of Demons walks across a swamp of blood filled with aborted children who try to stop them on their way to Maiden Estrella. Maiden Estrella is hated by the old hag of the valley for stealing from her the attention of men, but that woman is wrongly characterizing Estrella. Estrella abandoned the church and embraced the power of a demon's soul to gain the power to purify the souls of the inhabitants of the valley. The inhabitants are mad and attack anyone and anything to gain souls to offer to Estrella. She does not put up a fight after losing Garl, and offers up her soul to the Slayer of Demons willingly.
And then on my playthrough, I went through painstaking labors to kill Estrella directly without killing Garl Vinland, because I thought it'd be kind of fun to do, and it was a real pain in the ass, actually. And the dialogue was slightly different, but nothing really changed. Garl Vinland's red shadow was still outside when she went back, so I killed it, and then I screwed up Selen's quest, I think, so whoops. Yeah. And the interesting thing to me about Estrella is that even though she accepted the sins and the suffering of others with, like, the souls and whatnot, she was described to be, like, the one that was closest to God in that regard, which is just kind of really cool, and I think ties into that whole, like, purity and Kegare thing that I've talked about in, like, some of my videos and whatnot. If you do that fight in human form, there's a unique dialogue. I might have done it. No, I don't think I was in human form for that one. Okay. No, yeah, she abandoned the church. Well, kind of they abandoned her too. They kind of thought she was still working for them, but something must have gone wrong. But, I guess you could say, like, she didn't technically abandon her mission, but her methods went against, like, the church's teachings, perhaps. Yeah, in this world, God created the old one, true. And then there's also the ambiguity
After
of the
dying at the
old one
hands of
being
the
God.
Vanguard demon, or Dragon God if you're good at the game, the Slayer of Demons found themselves in the Nexus, a hidden temple which connects the northern land of Boletaria. Here, the Slayer of Demons met the Monumental and the Maiden in Black, and here they have their meetings with the inhabitants of Boletaria and learn from them lore, miracles, and magics. The Slayer of Demons is bound to the Nexus by the Monumental, and will not truly die until their purpose is fulfilled. The Monumentals were the half-living sentinels of the fabric of reality, who mended the world after the first scourge. One remains alive and is, with the exception of King Alant and the Maiden in Black, the most important character to understand, to grasp demon souls. The Monumentals were the heroes who survived the first scourge, and as I noted, they preserved the now fragile fabric of reality. Time passed, and the memory of the first scourge became hazy. As well, the Monumentals began to die. King Alant came to the Nexus and learned of the Soul Arts. He reawoke the Old One and unleashed the second scourge. At least, that's the official story. The Monumental notes that the Slayer of Demons must reverse their sin, and the crestfallen warrior says that the Monumentals awoke the Old One on a whim. Much can be inferred from the first part, and that second part is not a statement of objective fact. There's no reason to think the crestfallen warrior isn't just theory crafting or assuming. Some have theorized that the sin of the Monumental.
Hey, alright, somebody else who doesn't take NPCs at their word. So yeah, I think, wasn't there like another item which was supposed to be related to the Maiden in Black and her staff that elaborates on that a bit more? I just don't remember the specifics. We are the crestfallen warrior. Don't give up, skeleton.
Crafting or assuming. Some have theorized that the sin of the Monumentals connects to Alant and the Soul Arts. It's possible that they taught it to him, accidentally setting in motion Alant's descent into evil, but if you want to assume the worst, some have theorized that the Monumentals orchestrated these events to have a new generation of heroes rise up to replace themselves as they were dying off. The Maiden in Black is an ancient demon who was assumably birthed in the first scourge. She has immense powers to manipulate souls as seen in the skill of Soul Drain. It's an ability which the Slayer of Demons can learn from her soul, and it's the power to drain the souls of another. I don't think the Monumentals taught Alant to use the Soul Arts. I think the Maiden in Black did. Alant's demon doppelganger can use Soul Drain to de-level the Slayer of Demons in their fight, and the reason I think she taught the Soul Arts to Alant is because she wanted to die. The Maiden's soul-manipulating power allows her to transfigure the power of hostless souls into power for the Slayer of Demons, as well as what is her most incredible feat, lulling the Old One back to sleep should the player choose that ending. Like the Slayer of Demons, the Maiden is shackled to the Nexus by a nexial binding, which you can see is attached to her ankle, and thus she cannot die, even though she wants to. I don't think the Maiden only taught Alant the Soul Arts. I think she taught him how to communicate with the Old One, and had him reawaken it. She would have done that assumably to save herself from the misery of living forever, as the only way she can die is by lulling the Old One back to sleep, and going to sleep with it.
Don't you understand? No one wishes to go on.
As she binds the power of demons' souls to the Slayer of Demons, she slowly transforms them into a demon, and when all archdemons are defeated and the Old One starts howling, she clearly recognizes the howl instinctively as she refers to it as a voice of yore. The tone of her communication with the Old One is like that of a mother to her child or an owner to a pet, so these two are very likely linked on some level, whether it be the circumstances of their birth or simply that they know each other. She also introduces the Slayer of Demons as a replacement for Alant, which makes me think that the Maiden in Black might originally have been created as a servant of the Old One, which was imprisoned in the Nexus maybe after she put it to sleep the first time. If you're not convinced that she wants to die enough to have put Alant on the dark path, let me show you my evidence. 1. If you try to kill the Maiden in Black, she will actually apologize for not being killable. 2. In the end of the game, she is overjoyed at finally completing her mission. And 3. Near the end of the game, when the Old One has started howling, Sage Frake says,
Why? You have defeated all the demons, have you not? This ghastly howl. The Monumental has spoken of it before. There is a question I have long had in my mind. It is whether we are right to banish the Old One. And I now have the answer. And it is a resounding no. Listen closely. The Old One must not be cut off from us. If the Candle Maiden tries to entrap it, kill her. Then absorb the souls of the Old One for yourself. The Old One is an unfathomable deposit of energy. It contains all the souls collected by the demons. You will gain the power of a king, and I will gain knowledge from beyond. And that, my dear friend, is the righteous path. You must not allow trifling matters to dissuade you. The demon souls shall be ours. If truth be told, that woman has been tainted by demons herself. She would thank you in her death for relieving her agony.
Is that Gowry's voice actor? But anyway, I don't necessarily know if I would believe him there because he does have some very self-serving dialogue. So he might be right, but I just don't know exactly about that kind of final line there. It said that the demon that could steal one's soul with a single look is second only to the Old One in terms of power amongst demons. Okay. Is Frake actually the good ending? There really isn't a good or a bad ending in Demon Souls. Well, arguably the good one is you banish the Old One, but it's like, hey, half of all the souls in the world have still been eaten, idiot. Tea-Watered Houseplant says, it sounds a lot like Shabriri trying to convince you what to do, lol. Very self-serving dialogue, yeah. I feel like it's like half mixed in with truth, but like mostly, it's like, hey, it'd be pretty cool if you got all those souls, right?
This request of Frake's for the Slayer of Demons to spare the Old One and use it to harvest more souls is dark, and must be put into proper context before moving on. The presence of the Old One has heightened the state of reality. The emergence of the Old One has blurred the line between reality and myths, as it has manifested people's beliefs. The Shrine of Storms is an example of how the Old One has given power to the belief of ritualistic release of the spirit, and Maiden Estrella is a showcase of how the Old One has given power to the religious idea of purifying sin and malice. The Old One is not necessarily the catalyst of destruction. It might just be an amplifier of human desires. As I go over more in my Demon Souls analysis video, the evils of man tainted this world long before the arrival of the Old One.
I'd agree with
Sage
that.
Frake and Urbane hate each other, as Urbane considers magic to be a vile disfiguration of the soul arts, whereas his miracles are passed down by God. Sage Frake hates Urbane because he knows more than him. Frake was once a priest who abandoned the church, and assumably he did this after he discovered what it was that the church worshipped.
Do you have a connection to the disciples? Do not pay attention to them if they speak poorly of me and my magic. Prayer is for the foolish, quaint, and soon to be dead. And heaven forbid the day you find out what their so-called God really is.
The casting of miracles is done using talismans of God, and the casting of magic is done using catalysts. Both drain MP, and a rare item known as the Talisman of Beasts has the unique ability to cast both magic and miracles. Its item description reads, an old wooden amulet resembling the old one. It can utilize both miracles and spells. The symbol of God was nothing more than the image of the old one.
2 points to go along with that. First, the Maiden in Black theme song just absolutely slaps, even though it's like so quiet and somber. And then the second one is with the Talisman of Beasts. The Japanese used for like the old one is like the Great Old Beast or something along those lines. Maybe not Old Beast, but at the very least, it's just always called like the Beast or something along those lines. So them calling it the old one in English was just a product of localization for the most part. And so it makes sense that the Talisman of Beasts is the talisman of the old one. And then the symbol of God was nothing more than the image of the old one. So yeah. Definitely one of like the coolest items in all of like the Soulsborne catalog, just because of how much of a twist it is. Even though like Frake alludes to it, it's really cool to have something actually stated so plainly in the lore for once. If only they could repeat that in their newer titles, right? You never thought there was much to argue for the let's just blow it all up endings? Yeah. Also, welcome into the stream, Drewing. Demon Souls is definitely the most straightforward of them. Yeah, for sure. It would not be there if it was made by Modern FromSoft. Maybe. But yeah, they definitely dial up the cryptic aspects of the newer games.
It can utilize both miracles and spells. The symbol of God was nothing more than the image of the old one. The church and the magicians both draw their power from the old one, not from God. And both magic and miracles drain the same resource, MP, because they are the same thing, soul arts. Or doesn't the false King of Land cast both the spell Soul Drain and the miracle Wrath of God? All draws its power from the old one, so maybe Frake is right to not put it to sleep. Maybe its power can be used to mend a damaged world, or maybe Frake should get out more. Deep below the Nexus, the Old One howls and offers unlimited powers to those that will submit to it. For generations, the Nexus has contained the world, and the Maiden tended it. After destroying all the demons, including the false King of Land, the Slayer of Demons will face the Old One in the end and meet with the true King of Land. He will try to argue for his side as he desperately tries to subdue the Slayer of Demons. Alant has been transformed into a blob-like monster with no hope of victory, and after slaying him, the Slayer of Demons makes their final choice.
I like the little soul brand in his model there.
Walk away, and let the Maiden in Black save the world, returning it to the natural state which produced the horrors of the Valley of Defilement. Alternatively, the Slayer of Demons can kill the Candle Maiden and take the power of the beasts for themselves. Whatever choice they make, the world shall be plunged into a deep despair, and all hope for salvation and a bright tomorrow punished.
Surely you have seen for yourself the pain and suffering that fills this world. But fight poison with poison. God is merciful, and so created the Old One. The Old One will feed upon our souls and put an end to our tragic realm of existence. Don't you understand? No one wishes to go on.
And that's the Demon Souls lore breakdown. Thanks for watching. Longtime followers of this channel will know that this is my first venture into a strict story breakdown video, and I hope I did the game justice. I'm certain that there are some details I've missed or gotten wrong, and if you picked up any of those, I hope you'll contribute that information or theory in the comment section. I'll pin to this video a comment where I compile theories and corrections, and if you're watching this video sometime after release, you might find some enjoyment in reading it and seeing what the community has added to this video. The footage I've used was supplied by Blue Lizard Jello and Oozoshin. Both are very cool people and have their channels linked in the description box below. Also linked below is my Patreon account, where I release videos early, so if you think it's worth paying $1 to watch these videos a few days ahead of the normies, check that out. In all seriousness, I hope that the story of Demon Souls is a bit more clear to you than it was before you watched this video, and if you enjoyed, I hope you'll watch my look back at Demon Souls analysis video, where I delve deeper into the game, its inspirations, its narrative implications, and all those wonderful mechanics that make it the special gem it is. I'm AesirAesthetics. Take care.
Yeah, I think that was a really good video. Very straightforward, obviously going through Demon Souls lore, but I liked the format of going through like each Arkstone, because it just kind of makes sense, as well as having the whole section on the Nexus and then the epilogue with Allant and the Maiden in Black. So I liked the structuring of it overall, and they did a good job. So, okay, if you guys want to give AesirAesthetics a like, I have pinned, or not pinned it, but I've posted the link in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and like this video myself. And I'm kind of curious as to what pinned thing you got. Does he not actually like break it down more? God made it and humans began worshiping it because they confused the two. The mega comment is awesome. I didn't see anything with it. No. All right. Looks like the mega comment is a minor comment, a micro comment. Maybe I'm just missing something here. Yeah, it seems like more of a thread, but I thought Aesir was going to like post their addendums, but there's only like the one quote by them. All right, it's all good though. I was hoping to find some fun stuff to go along with that. Okay, so that was a good video by Aesir. Next, we have one more by SolePorpoise, saying goodbye to the Souls games. So this sounds a little bit dramatic. We'll see how that actually turns out for us. Yeah, the Demon Souls OST is really good. It might actually be my favorites because like Elden Ring's is good. I really like a couple tracks on the Elden Ring one, but Demon Souls kind of just feels a little bit more holistic to me. It's kind of hard to describe. Want to navigate to YouTube comments, keep dreaming. Yeah, that's why I often try to shill my Discord, just because YouTube comments are just kind of awful for having discussions. So if you guys want to talk more lore or games and stuff in general, join the Discord. It's pinned at the top of the chat, right up. Meow. I don't think, yeah, you guys can't see it on my screen. It's all good. Okay. It does feel like all the themes match to a common feeling. Elden Ring's OST feels a bit more disparate from song to song, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I don't know. It's just like the mood is a bit different with Demon Souls. All right, moving on to SolePorpoise's video.
I love Elden Ring, so please don't yell at me. What I'm about to say is a sincere look at the game, and is not a video to say why you shouldn't like it. Something I put in over 100 hours, something it's my game of the year so far, something I love this game, so please don't yell at me. So I finished Elden Ring and...
Alright, this is an S tier video because it has Underneath the Rotting Pizza. It is like its opening song here. Final Fantasy VII soundtrack, for those who don't know.
What can I say? I loved it. It has its problems, and while its lows were probably lower and longer than any other Soul Sekiro-born game for me, its highs were just about as high as any game can get. And who can complain about that? but I couldn't help but feel a little crestfallen by the end of it, because what I started to realize is it signals the end of an era. There's no question that FromSoft is going to make Elden Ring its default type game going forward now, and while I think a good portion of folks agree that the game comes up short in areas, I've noticed that the larger conversation isn't capturing the key issue for why that is for me. Even though people are acknowledging that there's something about the open world that makes the experience feel wrong, I'm not sure what's being discussed is an accurate representation of what's different. And that's partly due to the fact that the language in video game criticism is so messy right now.
So I think that's kind of fair. And this is something that I've thought about a lot, and we've kind of talked about it in the Discord a bit. I mean, every once in a while, like I feel like once you say your piece on this, it just kind of gets out there, and we don't talk about it a lot after we talk about like our impressions of the game, and we just kind of focus on the lore a bit more, which is perfectly fine. But the way that I feel about Elden Ring is the first experience is as close to an immaculate gaming experience as you're going to get, with the caveat if you kind of already know how to interact with the FromSoft game in terms of like leveling up and allocating your stat points. Just because if you don't understand that, you're probably going to be more likely to fall into the common first player playthrough trap of trying to want to try a little bit of everything and being good at nothing, which is a bit of a painful experience, which, you know, I got over after playing Dark Souls 1 my first time and having an absolutely trash, garbage, terrible build just because I wanted to know what everything did, versus like my second playthrough where I went unga bunga and just absolutely dominated, and the game kind of became a joke in comparison. So yeah, Elden Ring does have a really good experience if you do know what you're doing, but if you don't know, I'm not exactly sure how that's going to like play for newer players. But anyway, the point that I really want to make there is once you start playing through it more and more, a lot of the cracks really start to show. And even on the first playthrough, I was definitely starting to feel it towards the end of everything because I'd been exploring like every area as fully as I possibly could. And so that wasn't necessarily bad, but once it started to become a bit more formulaic, I realized that like it didn't really have the same level of polish that I felt like the more handcrafted levels of the previous games had. So with the exception of like the legacy dungeons, like Stormvale, absolutely phenomenal the first time going through. Raya Lucaria, fantastic. Lane Dell, really, really good. Halig Tree, great, you know? So like all those ones really stand out as being super polished, crafted experiences, whereas the open world can't really maintain that, especially as you're going through such a large area and exploring the side areas related to those, and things like the catacombs, the minor Erd trees. Generally speaking, I feel as though FromSoft wanted to incentivize players to explore, and the part that really makes it kind of not fit well together is that you don't really get good rewards for exploring because they tied exploration to the reward structure. I don't know what the better answer is in terms of like game crafting and keeping players like immersed in the game world, just because if you don't reward people for exploring, then they're disincentivized from exploring. But if you reward them too strongly, then they might feel pigeonholed into having to explore everything first before they do other stuff. So it's a really kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, which I think just kind of arises as a product of the scope of its game. So Spirit Ashes were cool ways to summon things or to like get some of those rewards built into the game. However, I feel like having so many smithing stone upgrades like localized to being more like mine areas was a big detriment to the game and stuff like that. So the crystal tiers were cool, but a lot of them are just going to be functionally useless for most people's builds. So they really should have tweaked how much the players got rewarded for doing certain things, I think. So there are different ways to address the problem. Like I would offer some solutions, but I'm sure like no matter what I offer, like somebody's going to disagree because that's the nature of the beast. And they might have an idea that works better for them, you know? So anyway, that's kind of my impression based off of like the first minute of what SolePorpoise was talking about like why Elden Ring feels like such a departure, because once the cat is out of the bag, can you go back to a Dark Souls 1 style experience after playing Elden Ring? Maybe. It's going to be hard, and like no matter what they do, they're going to get that comparison, I feel. So it's really interesting that we're kind of watching this video now, especially since Armored Core just got released this weekend, and seeing how players are going to react and adjust to that game, especially in like the FromSoft catalog. All right. Hey Stella, nice to see you again. You love Elden Ring, but the Shadow of the Colossus will always be your favorite open world game? That's been on my list to play for an extremely long time, and I still haven't gotten around to it. Yeah, open world games are too afraid of being empty. It's very understandable, because even though, like, Breath of the Wild is an open world game, it does feel kind of empty to me, just like whenever I see anybody play it, and it just kind of turns me off from the world. And to be fair, like, even Wind Waker is a pseudo open world game that has a ton of emptiness, so you can contain emptiness in the world if it kind of makes sense. But to be fair, I also hated the ship navigation of Wind Waker and just like how much time it took to get between places. Yeah, you prefer empty to copy and paste. Yeah, it just kind of depends on like the vibes of the game itself, I think, and whether or not the travel itself is enjoyable. Like, it was actually really fun just going around on Torrent and jumping over things, seeing what was under, like, ruins and rubble, like, what was over the next hill. Like, exploration in Elden Ring was, like, truly the best part of it, which is really good for an open world game. Like, it was the first game in a very, very long time where I was excited to see what was around the next corner, so much so that I'd be, like, thinking about it when I wasn't playing. You hope they do one big Elden Ring DLC and then just call it good? Yeah, we'll see. It's going to be really rough because no matter what they do, I don't think it'll meet players' expectations, because I'm sure some are going to expect like a large open world style area, or some might expect a giant legacy dungeon or two, or I've wondered whether or not they're going to like reskin the existing world with like a spirit world and then just kind of change things, like kind of similarly to how like bonfire aesthetics affected Dark Souls 2 stuff, but maybe in a more robust kind of manner. So yeah, honestly, I feel like the biggest win they could accomplish with the DLC would be adding more stuff to the base game to make New Game Plus cycles more relevant. So things like PvP or like challenge modes, randomizers, if you've already completed the game, that would just, you know, be a no-brainer to me to like actually bump up the value of the game way more than I think anything else could. Armored Core has been great so far. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen like some of the more negative video or negative reviews on Steam, but some of them are hilarious. That was me. All right, so anyway, going back to SolePorpoise's video here, now that I step off my soapbox. More swamps, indeed.
That's right. This is another obsessive look at what's wrong with language in video game criticism. And by the end of this, we'll hopefully be able to agree not necessarily what's wrong with Elden Ring, but at the very least, why many of us are seemingly feeling the same dissatisfaction with its change in direction. And it's worth noting, I know traditional Souls games are likely never coming back, and no amount of internet complaining is going to change that. Anyway, so I'm going to complain on the internet now, and this is going to require an examination of what Elden Ring is, what its predecessors are, and where we're going to start exploring genre in video games.
So like, looks like this one's a little bit about language, which is right up my alley.
As it is, it seems like gameplay genres are primarily based on marketing decisions to attract already existing fan bases, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Personally, I know I need to know what a game genre is before I buy it, add it to my growing Steam list of unplayed games, and then never play it, because I'm a huge piece of shit and everyone has their preferred genres, whether it be JRPGs, CRPGs, first-person shooters, third-person shooters, roguelikes, roguelites, racing, open-world games, simulators, dopamine extractors,
Whoa, that's good dopamine!
RTS, sports, or whatever else you can think of. It's paramount we know what a game's game genre is before we buy it to know if we'll like it. In other words, the game genre affects the marketability of the game, so it's not wrong for publishers to have this mentality when deciding what kind of game they're going to make next. People like shooters now? Cool.
I think that's like half true to an extent and is just kind of dependent on the player. Certainly there's a lot of overlap between like liking one thing from one genre versus like other things in that genre. But I don't know if people typically look at genre first when they purchase a game. How do you guys feel about that in chat? Like, I just look to see if the game looks good in terms of like the gameplay. So, for instance, like I was looking at the Path of Exile 2's new Druid trailer that came out on like YouTube yesterday, and I thought it looked amazing and it had like a ton of actual like systemic upgrades to the original Path of Exile 1. And so that excited me. Like, obviously it's a bit of a slower style game, but it just looks like a gigantic improvement, especially like with the way that they were doing combo attacks with the skills in comparison to a game like Diablo 4, which I haven't played just because like I've already played like Path of Exile, and D4 didn't really feel like it was changing enough of the formula to kind of attract me as a player. So it's not like I'm an automatic shoe-in for that genre of games, but yeah. You feel the same? You're only looking for genres when you're specifically looking for horror games? I can totally see that, because yeah, that'll be kind of harder to just kind of discover on your own. More lore like some medieval fantasy, you're a very easy buy. Kingdom Rush to Dragon Age, if you understand your meaning? Yeah, okay. First boss in Armored Core 6 has been an overtuned gatekeeper. I've heard he's a little tough, but honestly, it seems like most of the people, at least in my circle, are progressing through the game really quickly. Although I'm definitely more familiar with like hardcore players of FromSoft games, to be fair. Okay.
Make a ton of shooters. People like motion controls now? Let's make our own. People like open world games now? Everything should be an open world game. But I think something's missing from this discussion when publishers seemingly make games largely or even solely based on this reason. Because
Yeah, I totally get where he's coming from with this comparison. And to be fair, I don't necessarily think that's as much of a recent problem. There's always been kind of shovelware for every console that's ever existed. Like if I say regular Nintendo, what games come to your guys' mind? It doesn't really matter because you're not thinking of like the literal 600 trash games that belong in the garbage that can't even compare to the ones that you're thinking of. Diablo 4 couldn't keep you either. You're a very different man post FromSoft. Yeah. Welcome back to the stream, Davin. Nice to see you again. You avoid games by genre, such as sports games? Oh, okay, yeah, that could be kind of fair too. So, yeah, that makes sense.
games are in fact unique from other mediums in that they have two genres. There's the narrative genre, and then there's the gameplay genre. Depending on who you ask, the definitions for these can be simplified in different ways, but my favorite explanation comes from Ernest Adams, who says the narrative genre describes the content, and the gameplay genre describes the challenge. Now, this isn't all that hard to recognize, and once it's articulated like this, it becomes a no-duh kind of identification. The narrative genre of Halo, i.e. its content, falls in the science fiction genre, and the gameplay genre, i.e. its challenges, falls in the first-person shooter genre, which requires we aim properly in a 3D space from the character's point of view when pulling the trigger. Again,
okay, I'm on board with what he's saying now. At first, I was like, I don't know about that, just because, like, when I was thinking narrative, I was thinking of, like, that in the plot sense rather than, like, a classifying sense here. I get what they're saying. In genre versus vibes, you'll take vibes every time, for sure. Phoenix Wright is the best game because the narrative is challenging.
Nothing too exciting here. But as I always like to discuss, and the reason that I bring it up, is to talk about how the gameplay and narrative can work together. Because when the gameplay and narrative work together, games can offer a cathartic experience, even when we're talking about something as basic as genres. To better understand what I mean by this, let's look.
So the first example that comes to mind is Bloodborne, obviously because I really like Bloodborne, but just because the thing that really stood out to Bloodborne for me in terms of like the marriage between gameplay mechanics and like narrative world building is the fact that the most effective hunters are going to be the ones that will continue to rally their HP against enemies that are already dead. And if you think about that from an objective standpoint, if you just see some hunter hacking away at the corpse of something that they just killed, it'd be very, very difficult to tell whether that hunter is good at their job or if they're literally going insane. And that was just, once that clicked for me, I was like, oh my God, just like so many small details go to like build up the actual like universe of this game. So that's just kind of what comes to my mind right here.
Look at a series that hasn't just changed its gameplay genre over the years, it's changed its narrative genre as well. The Resident Evil series. Because I want to talk about how these decisions to change the narrative genre, along with the gameplay genre, affect the emotion of the game. The original game tells a traditional gothic horror story about experiments and a virus run amok, but it doesn't just tell its story through its diary entries, secret underground laboratories, and cutscenes. It's also told through the gameplay and what we're talking about here, the gameplay genre. Because this game is technically a third-person shooter, and that means it's able to show the character through Hitchcockian camera angles and distances. That translates to the menacing sense that players are being watched. It's a sense of paranoia that creeps into your consciousness long after you've turned off the game. What's more is, the original game is one that helped shape its gameplay genre of survival horror, a genre that's meant to make players feel unprepared for the horrors of the game. In Resident Evil's case, the player has ammunition and guns, but they think twice before using these resources since there's a looming sense that they can run out of these items at a time they need it most. It gives players a sense of self-doubt in all of their combat choices, and they never feel quite prepared for what's around the next corner. The result is a potent emotion that has players considering the horror of the narrative through the horrors of the gameplay. Thinking of this concept in terms of a formula, and it becomes a little more firm. Start with a narrative genre that offers a fairly well-told horror story. Amplify it with the emotion provided by the gameplay genre, where players feel their anxiety increase as each bullet in their supply decreases, as well as a sense of paranoia from the camera, and the game spits out a tangible emotion, in this case, fear and paranoia. So,
I like their point of saying that, like, looking at the main character from that third-person perspective makes you feel as though you're being watched, and that adds to the fear and paranoia. Because I don't really enjoy horror games or even, like, a lot of horror films just because they don't really do it for me. So that's not kind of an experience that I'm familiar with. And typically for me, a horror game is something as silly and simple as, like, Metroid Prime, where I've made a lot of progress. I'm low on life or supplies or whatever, and I'm struggling to get back to the save point. That's like my nightmare for a video game, but that's like not really the same thing by any stretch of the imagination.
Mission accomplished here. The game is as scary as it is, not only because the narrative works, but because the gameplay reinforces it. Moving on to Resident Evil 4, and we see a much different game. Gone are the creepy monsters that waited off camera in tight corners. Now we have a Halloween town of monsters that resemble the lineup of what you'd see in a haunted house. Gone are the characters who acknowledge their predicament and are working towards escaping this nightmare.
Richard, what the hell happened to you? Chris, this place... Get your team out of here. Demons everywhere.
Now we have a character who says James Bond-like quips when mouthing off to the bad guy.
So maybe you have 9 lives, but it doesn't matter now, Mr. Kennedy. I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
And while the narrative horror seems to now be tongue-in-cheek, or even just plain stupid at times, the game mechanics offer much more power to players. While this is still a third-person shooter, this is now an action third-person shooter. Players now control the camera, and with that, they have the freedom to do more damage. Not only are there bonus points for shooting well, there's interactive environments so we can gain dominance over these slow-moving monsters. Lastly, while there are some elements of survival horror here, it's largely removed. Whether it be upgrading weapons, upgrading your storage space, using grenades with huge blast zones and damage, luring enemies into traps, or literally suplexing enemies via button prompt, the game is doing everything it can to make players feel empowered. And this combination of the gameplay and narrative genres becoming closer to action with horror aesthetics makes for a game that's a ton of fun, but it's not very scary. And as we all know, Resident Evil 7 takes us back to its survival horror roots that made this series as successful as it is. Just about everything is back from the original game to evoke an actual sense of horror that you got from the gameplay and narrative synergizing like it did in the original game, except for the third-person camera. Now we have a first-person camera, and with that, the horror is that much more immediate. Gone is the avatar that stood between players and the dangers of this world. Now what we see is what our character sees. And more than that, we now have a constrained screen space with which to see enemies. The whole thing makes it so there's a sense of claustrophobia as we navigate these tight spaces and hear threatening noises while knowing it's up to us and only us to clear these threats as they arise. This is all to say, changing the gameplay genre creates a different kind of horror experience. While we no longer have paranoia of being watched like we had in the original game, we now have a sense of claustrophobia, meaning the trade-off still creates emotion that complements the narrative genre. Looking at this series, we get
Yeah, I think these are all like very strong points that they're making, and I think it's really good to bring attention to this just because it's really easy for this stuff to fly under the radar. And like they were saying at the beginning of the video, it does make it a bit more difficult to talk about what you liked in one game but doesn't necessarily work for you in the other game. So just being able to articulate this kind of point a lot more clearly can help people understand what they actually feel, and they can express themselves better as a consequence of that. So I'm really enjoying this video so far. Rabs Rabble, welcome to the stream again. You said, the forest was the only game that was able to startle you. You love Dead Space, but having a naked cannibal run behind you on all fours in a dark forest is something primal. Fat Brett has really good commentary for Resident Evil 7, the balance of empowerment versus disempowerment versus disempowered balance. Interesting. Rain Transform says, you wonder how much of this kind of way of seeing games holds up at a high-level play, since even Resident Evil 1 just evolves into running past all the enemies with little effort or fear once you know it well. That's an interesting thing as well. And yeah, whether or not games hold up the same way, the more familiar you get with them could be a good point to bring up. But I do think what you say definitely has merit and value. I just don't think he's examining it from that lens quite yet. Elden Ring looks weird here.
get a good understanding of how interwoven the gameplay and narrative genres are to the emotion the game is trying to convey. It's a game series that understands that its narrative isn't just an excuse for the gameplay to exist, and the gameplay genre doesn't exist simply to make it more attractive to the market. Instead, it understands the narrative is a tool, just like the gameplay is a tool, and they both accomplish the same goal. They both work to influence players' emotions. And this really is what I'm getting at, because the gameplay genre of a game can offer all sorts of emotion to amplify the story's content. And what I want to look at now is how my favorite gameplay genre, Metroidvanias, offer some of my favorite titles out there, but only when the genre keeps in mind what we just learned about when it comes to the gameplay and narrative genres, amplifying the other's emotion. So allow me to confess something that I've only said in passing on my Twitch streams. I love Metroidvanias. They're easily some of my favorite games by a large margin, but I need to offer a caveat. I hate Metroidvanias. It has some of the most banal titles I've ever forced myself to play. And there's some...
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it too. I really like Metroidvanias when they're done right, and I kind of only really like them a lot on kind of like the first playthrough. It does feel really easy for me to become fatigued by Metroidvanias, just because a lot of them kind of end up feeling a bit formulaic, especially like the Castlevania stuff that he was showing off, Super Metroid. So I'm trying to think of like why I feel that way, or why I like certain Metroidvanias over other ones. Like Cave Story might be my favorite Metroidvania that I've ever played. It's just a phenomenal little game developed by one indie developer. Check it out if you haven't. I did really like Super Metroid. It does have a lot of going on for it. The world is just kind of a little bit too big to me, but that's probably just because I only played it like a couple times over the years, and so I wasn't as big of a fan of like all the backtracking. But that's also probably because I don't know like a lot of the intricacies of like being able to go out of bounds and do things out of sequence. So that's something that I think is also really cool about Metroid, and I appreciate about like all of their games like that. And another good Metroidvania that I played was called Time Spinner. It's on Steam. It's like $5 or $10, something like that. It kind of like felt like Illusion of Gaia meets Metroid, which was pretty cool. It was all right, but other games are kind of harder to quantify. Like in some ways, Terraria is kind of like a Metroidvania. I enjoy a lot of that, but I also tried to play, what's the game called? Noita. And I thought I'd really enjoy it because it kind of reminded me a lot of Terraria, and it had like more of the kind of elements of like sandbox Metroid style stuff, like more shooter stuff, but I just couldn't really get into it. So yeah. Oh, it's free on Epic? Hollow Knight? Yeah, and Hollow Knight is another one where I just couldn't get into its art. And so it just never really interested me. Which I know is kind of sacrilege because of how many people actually enjoy it. Metroidvanias being as popular of a choice for game making as they became, or being as popular as they became, had disastrous consequences for gaming. True story. Drew says, horror games work best when they're just difficult to know they'll kill you for reals, but not so difficult that you're bored facing the chainsaw guy for the 15th time. True. Oh, on August 31st, Cave Story Plus is free on Epic. Yeah, thanks. I didn't know that. So, if you guys want a fantastic game to get in like 5 days, get Cave Story Plus for real. It's art of all things. Yeah, I just don't like. I don't like how the background kind of blends into the foreground, and it's not bad. The style just doesn't appeal to me for whatever reason. Kind of like Ori and the Blind Forest. I wasn't super into that game just because like the visuals. So I always say don't judge a game by the graphics, but I think it's fair to judge games by like their visual styles and or titles. Is a Metroidvania a platformer but with a focus on shooting, like Blasphemous is like a hack and slash platformer? Kind of. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a platformer, although there can be like platforming elements to it, like the original Metroid and Castlevania, obviously. But typically, my understanding of a Metroidvania, and I'm sure there could be arguments about it, is just kind of a certain genre of games where you pass through like an interconnected map, exploring things, getting new power-ups, and which allow you to go back to other certain parts of the map to progress forward. So, in a certain sense, you can make the argument that Dark Souls is kind of like a Metroidvania, but just a 3D one. But that also depends on if you want to say like a Metroidvania is 2D only. You quit Hollow Knight after you gathered every single grub and the guy ate them. Taste of visuals is subjective. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel. Like, I have nothing like really against them. I just couldn't really get attracted to them enough to actually want to play it. Dark Souls is Zelda for adults. I would say Alundra is Zelda for adults, if you guys haven't played that. Alundra on PlayStation 1 and Landstalker on Sega Genesis were both really good games. Landstalker is a little bit rough, especially nowadays, because of the isometric view. Alundra was fantastic if you really enjoyed the 2D Zelda games, but yeah. Alright. Enough getting off topic here, because I'm sure they'll have some really insightful stuff to like make me rethink or redefine what I'm feeling right now. Zelda where? Zelda here.
Something worth discussing in the fact that my experience with Metroidvanias is so hit and miss, because I think I finally figured out why that is, and it has to do with what we were just talking about. Some games are Metroidvanias because they complement the story, and some games are Metroidvanias because there's a decent-sized audience with appetite for them, and a little more thought put into them than that.
Yeah, and the next Metroidvania I want to play is this one, Deedlit in whatever this one is. So Deedlit is a character from Record of Lodoss War, and I've just heard really good things about this game. So whenever I get like the free time. Oh yeah, like another Metroidvania that I got but I didn't get into for whatever reason was man, what's it called? It came out on PS4. They recently, well, not like super recently, came out with like a second version, Axiom Verge, right? Yeah, I think that's it. So yeah, I really, really liked the visuals of that one, but I played it a little bit and I just didn't get like super sucked in, so I didn't keep playing. Not because I didn't want to play, I just or not because I disliked it, but just because like I didn't keep wanting to play something like that. Yeah, so this is like a fan game, but I guess they like officially sanctioned it. So I've heard it's really good, and I need to check it out. Yep, they are still repping Deedlit.
And this really is my litmus test for what makes a good Metroidvania. Whether they understand how important the gameplay mechanics that come with the genre are in influencing players' emotions. To better understand what I'm getting at, let's quickly look more in depth into Metroidvanias, their mechanics and how those mechanics translate into emotion, and how that emotion helps communicate the goals of the story. And I don't want to spend too much time on what Metroidvanias are, because largely we all have a general idea. You got your interconnected maps that are designed to be mazes, you got your backtracking, you got your forks in the road with nothing but your intuition to tell you which way to go, you have your non-linear progress, you have your power-ups and keys that allow you further traversal to unexplored parts of the map, you got your enemies that respawn when activating arbitrary switches, you got your save points, you got your bosses, and so on. Altogether and done correctly, these design concepts lead to a gameplay loop with tangible emotion. And I want to focus on what I think is the most important part of the gameplay loop in a Metroidvania, exploration. Because I think it's tempting to think that this is a simple concept. After all, we know what exploration is. You're completing areas that you haven't yet experienced that are still mysterious. But I want to look in depth into exploration, going beyond just the colloquial definition, and look at it as a game mechanic. Because I think the difference identifies the reason this game genre struggles with consistency as much as it does. My definition of exploration as a game mechanic is twofold. Exploration first has to do with the player's own choices determining where they go next, meaning the game has to make it clear that players are making choices in these moments, and additionally, there should be tangible risk associated with that choice.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I felt about Noita compared to Terraria, or even something like Risk of Rain. Like, I didn't understand exactly what I was doing and where I was trying to go, or like what my choices really led to. Whereas it was a hell of a lot more intuitive in Terraria and even like Risk of Rain. And the reason why I say Risk of Rain, even though it's certainly not a Metroidvania, is because it kind of has this shooter style element that I felt was more in common with Noita than like Terraria especially. So Blasphemous is a Metroidvania then? Okay.
Take a recent example of the genre that's also an ideal example of this. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. This is a game with some of the most complicated maps I've ever seen, meaning it's full of choices for players to make, but they aren't just cramped hallways. Exploring these paths will take you to huge vistas that, if studied carefully, you can recognize when you're on different parts of the map to help orient yourself. There are optional paths that lead to more optional paths, and paths that players might only discover if they're looking carefully. It challenges players to divine where the crit path is, and where the optional rewards are. And depending on what they choose, they'll find strong enemies, platforming challenges, shortcuts, and of course, rewards. This is to say, it takes some poking and prodding that comes entirely from the player's own curiosity. And as they poke and prod, they're fully aware that at any time, they can walk down a path that they can't yet handle. Or they can, but their controller's being really weird right now. In other words, this is the risk. And they're tempted to try new paths because they can receive rewards that makes this very exploration I'm describing less risky. In other words, this is the player's choice in how they will engage with the map. What I'm trying to say is, exploration is easier said than done. A game really does need to make sure it's following both these rules to make exploration qualify as a game mechanic and thus become a part of the game genre's challenge.
Yeah, and if I were to compare like two games that is more familiarly associated with this channel, like Dark Souls 1, exploration felt way better, even though it was still a major pain in the ass and I would die all the time, compared to Dark Souls 2, where it was a major pain in the ass and I would die all the time, but it just felt like the devs were rubbing salt in the wound and kind of teasing me and making the game overly difficult and overly tedious because that's what they thought like Dark Souls was supposed to be. And then I feel like Dark Souls 3 kind of got it right again, where like exploration was arguably better in some ways compared to like Dark Souls 2, but not as robust as DS1 with the whole like going back to the hub world, getting new powers, going back to different areas to do different things in those areas, relatively speaking. So it's a little bit of a break with Dark Souls 3 compared to like DS1 and DS2 though. Yeah, I don't like DS2 very much. So, like, DS2 has good ideas. It has a lot of potential, but just the execution was it wasn't it. Yeah.
Challenges. But what I think is most important to what I'm describing here, and is unfortunately easy to overlook, is how exploration differs from completion. To see completion in action, we no longer have the two elements I said was so important to exploration. To better understand what I mean, let's take an obvious example from the open world game Horizon Forbidden West. Sure, players can survey the land where they don't yet know what lies ahead, and it's tempting to call that exploration, but the primary way in which players decide to interact with this world is through quests, and more importantly, quest markers, as this is where the bulk of their experience points or rewards comes from. With these mechanics, players aren't making carefully considered decisions on their own as they navigate an unmapped region, nor do they feel as though there's any real risk for going towards a quest marker. It's just something they'll do now because their level matches the level in the quest description, and if it's too high for them now, they'll do it later. Meaning, not only is there almost no decision making involved, there's almost no risk involved either. It's just an option for them to do something should they choose to do it. This is the difference between completion and exploration, which is to say, exploration is no small thing. When it's done right, it won't make us feel as though we're completing the game, but rather our decisions and skill level are integral to our success. And again, this confusion of exploration and completion is done all the time in modern Metroidvanias, and it makes them fall flat. It can come in the form of linear design with backtracking to obfuscate the linearity, autosave mechanics that only trigger on the crit path, thereby making advancement in the game feel like there's a progress ratchet, so you know you're going in the right direction, meaning the game has unintentionally eliminated decision making. Procedurally generated maps that make our choices feel random and therefore we don't think twice about it, or it can be literal lines on the map outlining the path we're supposed to take. Developer choices like these might seem benign or even beneficial for players, but they're ultimately what vitiates emotion. Now players simply rely on the game's larger systems to guide them. And when the game's systems are guiding players more than their own instincts or choices, exploration is forfeited from the equation, and players are simply completing the game. Contrast this with Metroidvanias that understand how important exploration is in communicating emotion, and it's an entirely different ballgame. Something like Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Here we have very few systems to exploit, and if you crank up the difficulty to the highest, there's serious risk for one of the many choices you make. And again, this creates tangible emotion. Feeling stressed about how much HP I have left and fatigued about how long it's been since I last encountered a save point is some of the most tense experiences I've had in gaming, because if I died, I would have to start all over and potentially lose my experience if I don't reach at least as far as I made it this time. But on the other hand, once I
Yeah, and that's kind of exactly how I felt going through Metroid Prime. And Metroid Prime 2 didn't work for me just because, like, there was so much backtracking that it felt a little bit tedious, especially with, like, the dark and light mechanic. So it was a cool idea. It's just, like, the execution for me could have used a little bit of refinement. DS2 at least had multiple ways to get to a single area. DS3 was just horrible when it came to exploration, especially with areas and how they're connected. I think yes and no, because a lot of DS2's weaknesses in terms of exploration isn't so much like getting to like the Lost Bastille from either like the Fisherman's Wharf or Forest of the Fallen Giants. It's as much as it is like going through each level individually and exploring things and having things attacking you from your blind spots, or developers like putting traps in ways that didn't feel like very satisfactory, or having more stuff to reward exploration in general. So for me, like a couple of the things that stand out in that front are like how many Barrows Lockstone contraptions are just completely useless or will actively try to harm the player, versus a game like Zelda where if you use a bomb, it's a you know, a finite resource, but you can at least get it back. But there is a little bit of I want to say like dedication in terms of like making the choice to use that bomb to break open a cracked wall versus like trying to use it on an enemy or something like that. And so, while DS2 does have more interconnectedness within its levels, I feel like the actual level design in the Scholar of the First Sin edition is a little bit too hostile for me to actually enjoy going through those levels in the first place, if that makes sense. Yeah, and I feel exactly the same way that Rain Transform does, in that DS2's opening cutscene having the NPCs telling the player that they're going to die over and over again is both cringe and representative of the game's design philosophy. And yeah, as soon as they said that line, that really like took me out of of the game, where it just became too much like a meta thing, and I just didn't like it. T doesn't mind backtracking, but Dark Ether was painful backtracking. Exactly. So like, you don't feel empowered going through the darkness, you feel encumbered, which I think is a big part of the exploration compared to the other Metroid games, where like, as soon as you got like the Varia suit in Super Metroid, like you knew where you could go next and you were like looking forward to it. The Varia suit made you like stronger, like you got upgrades going back and backtracking, or like the screw attack, you know? Whereas like doing the shadow stuff, it was more painful than going through the first time, so it just did not work. You don't know whether to blame DS1's audience for only ever praising the game for its high difficulty, or FromSoft for taking that so much to heart, but it had unfortunate consequences. Well, I mean, a lot of it was a very troubled development stage, and them just kind of like cobbling things together last minute after changing directors, which is kind of ironic considering what happened with Demon's Souls, but I feel like the reason people praised DS1 for its difficulty is because during that era of gaming specifically, there was a hell of a lot more hand-holding with like the quest markers, the obnoxious UIs, just the overall difficulties of games being extremely lower in comparison. And for me, Dark Souls 1 felt like a return to Mega Man, where you would get your ass kicked going through the level your first, second, third, fourth time playing through it, and then slowly you'd get your own like player experience and be able to navigate that level with a bit of mastery to get to the boss and then get your ass kicked 10 more times. So then by the time you did actually get to the boss, you'd long since mastered the level, and the game taught you how to play and it didn't hold your hand. So you got to where you wanted to get based off of your own merit for the most part. And of course, some level designs were a bit more troubling than others, like Airman Got House and I is a thing for a reason, but yeah. Alright, going back to the video now.
Do reach a save point after exploring, fighting, running low on health stims and force points, there's a tangible sense of relief. Now I can rest, replenish my health and health items, spend the experience I earned, and most importantly, save the progress I made getting here. Same goes for finding power-ups and force powers that attract me to explore not just the crit path, but all available paths, meaning there's a genuine sense of excitement that's a result of my exploration that has nothing to do with me following quest markers, task lists, or a game's tell. Everywhere I go because I have a goal in mind when making that choice, and every choice I make is coded in risk. And this is the kind of tangible emotion I'm talking about. There's a feeling of isolation and excitement, tension and reward, self-doubt and relief that comes along with the gameplay genre when using exploration, not completion, as a mechanic. And the reason I'm going as in-depth as I am about what emotion Metroidvanias are capable of communicating is because the sooner this is understood, the sooner games can pair these emotions with the stories they want to tell. Because when the narrative genre is communicating the same thing, you get an emotionally potent game. An example I can think of off the top of the dome is, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. This is a story about the well-known empire that has now squashed any form of resistance. To communicate this, the opening shot is one that's likely familiar. It's a callback to the opening scenes from episodes 4, 5, and 6, except it's not. Instead of this being the introduction to a literal Star War, the game establishes that fight is long over. This isn't a story about a chosen one Jedi who will be taught the ways of the Force, and will go on to be so powerful that he's the only one who can overthrow the prevailing evil. It's instead a story about a Jedi who's turned his back on his training, who only now wants to live a normal life in the blind spots of the Empire. Because for the protagonist, Cal Kestis, he too realizes that this battle has already been fought and lost, and it's much too big for him to participate in it now. And so now he works an ordinary job, trying his best to blend in and leave his past behind him. However, once the character stumbles upon an old Jedi ship that's long been destroyed but not yet discovered.
Come take a look at this. It's a Jedi fighter. What a score! It's a real scrapper's payday.
Cal carefully wipes the dust off it, revealing the Jedi Order symbol. And now, Cal too will be discovered as a Jedi, hiding in plain sight.
We seek a dangerous fugitive. This is no common anarchist, but a devotee of the treasonous Jedi Order.
and so too will he now renew his fight against the Empire. And with this opening scene, the game really does establish everything it needs to in order to set up the emotion of the story. The subversion of the epic space battles that opened other Star Wars stories establishes the fight, and the optimism to win it is long finished. The link between Cal and the Jedi ship establishes the battle continues as long as there are those to fight it, and the immensity of the Empire shows just how small a single dissenter is in comparison to it. Ultimately, this is one of the most powerful Star Wars stories I've experienced that establishes just what a force the Empire is. It's an unstoppable machine that grinds up anything in its path and targets anyone who values their individuality. And this is why we have the second sister as the villain who kills indiscriminately.
To the Empire, we're all just expendable.
Yes, you are.
But more importantly to the story, she used to be a Jedi like Cal before she abandoned her humanity and became an apparatus of this machine. And one losing their humanity seems to be a natural evolution for all who join the Jedi. And we know this because this is something that's explicitly stated.
You know, I was a Jedi. It'd be fun to bring you in. Watch you crack like the rest of us!
In this way, she's a foil to the main character, a character who represents individualism and humanity as he questions himself and whether or not he'll be able to maintain those values.
The Ninth Sister said something about becoming an Inquisitor like it's inevitable.
Because as is part of his character conflict in the game, he knows that at any time, he can take the same path as the second sister. And while he won't be able to solely stop the Empire, he will be able to disrupt some of its plans. It's not a story about gaining ultimate power. It's a story about balancing power through the power the Empire overlooks, the power of our humanity, even if we are dwarfed by comparison to it. This is why a Metroidvania's emotions works as well as it does in this context. This isn't supposed to be a story where the player feels as though if they helped enough NPCs with their wants and needs, they will be rewarded for it as a reflex, and they'll repeat this until they earn enough reward, experience, and money to defeat the final bad guy. Nor is this supposed to be a story where the player feels as though they can simply exploit the extra diegetic game systems in order to beeline it to and defeat the final boss. This is
All right, now I'm kind of understanding where he's going for, or like what he's trying to do with like this comparison to Jedi Fallen Order, because as a Sweet Potato Dado had said, is this just an ad for Jedi Fallen Order? Yeah, because I was a little bit disappointed that he like brought up this game specifically when there's so many other Metroidvanias to choose from for like the fourth or fifth time in this video now. But Rain Transformed said, Uncharted 1 came out long before Dark Souls 1, and that game on the hardest difficulty still poops on every FromSoft game in terms of difficulty, at least without resorting to challenge runs. So what I was trying to say with like the Dark Souls 1 difficulty isn't that it's like, oh my god, the most difficult game in like a decade, but just to give like a bit of context, Dark Souls 1 came out in 2011, and these are like the top games from 2011. So we've got Portal 2, fantastic game, don't get me wrong, Batman Arkham City, Skyrim, Deus Ex, Uncharted 3, Dead Space 2, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, 3, Saints Row, Battlefield, Zelda Skyward Sword, so, you know, the top Zelda one in the franchise, Bastion, Super Mario 3D Land, Rayman Origins, Infamous 2, Assassin's Creed Revelation, Mortal Kombat, Sonic Generations, just to kind of like give some perspective. So I feel like these games aren't like the most contained games. So let's go back to 2010 just to give a little bit more context. Mass Effects 2, Red Dead Redemption, Call of Duty Black Ops, Super Meat Boy, StarCraft 2, Amnesia, Civ 5, well, that one sticks around, God of War 3, Limbo, Halo Reach. So, anything else super crazy? WoW Cataclysm. Ooh. So that's just to give like some context of the kind of games that were coming out at around this time. And so, well, certainly some of these games are still difficult and like very narratively driven. I would say like Dark Souls 1 compared to these games especially was very hands off and let the players kind of explore for themselves again, which was something that was not very common. Like, I think Ico was like the closest to Dark Souls. Well, obviously Demon Souls, but like Ico, Shadow of the Colossus rather. Like those were like the last couple games I think that were really similar in terms of like the design of DS1 perhaps. Yeah, so I'm not trying to say like the appeal of Dark Souls 1 was its difficulty. It was the fact that its difficulty was challenging, yet allowed the player to approach it however they wanted to, and it wasn't overbearingly difficult for the sake of being overbearing like Dark Souls 2 was. But yeah, it was just a very different design philosophy compared to its contemporaries at the time. Scaleasy, welcome back in. You just did the tutorial mission for AC6. The reviews weren't even exaggerating how good the game is. On topic, the Soul-style games are only as hard as you make them. True. Once you understand them, you can beat the game mechanics. Oh, you can bend the game mechanics to your benefit. The real issue is how difficult it is to get to that point. Bend the game. That makes sense. You enjoy power gaming, so you're probably biased towards the Soul-style upgrade and level up system. Yeah, it was for me. It's like the off-the-leash feeling, as Drew Wing says. Okay, so let's go back to the video now.
This is a story about a character who's constantly aware they can be destroyed or consumed by the Empire's power. And that's something we're aware of in almost every door we unlock and every path we decide to follow. In other words, we feel it through the gameplay. Now, for the record, while I've spent a lot of time talking about exploration, it's only a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, to make a good Metroidvania. There's a lot more that goes into making this genre what it is, but what I really wanted to focus on was the gameplay genre's ability to make players feel emotion through its mechanics. Because just like we can see here, the gameplay genre is one of the most impactful choices developers can make, not just in marketing the game, but as a tool with which they can make players feel the impact of their stories. That's true for all kinds of different stories. It's true if you're telling a story about a Jedi Knight using whatever resources he can find to slow an Imperial machine, a bounty hunter exploring an alien planet that's entirely hostile to her, a knight exploring the ruins of a fallen kingdom, or a chosen undead who's to rekindle what's left of a flame in a dying land. Because that's correct, Dark Souls is a Metroidvania. So let's briefly talk about this.
When are they gonna get to the
Elden Ring.
Look, I'm sorry I have to do this as well, but unfortunately the language in this discussion has become so sloppy, I need to address this subject directly. So bear with me just a little longer because we're almost there. Again, there's a small section of the internet that wants to argue over whether Dark Souls actually qualifies as a Metroidvania. And look, I get it. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when a game does become this genre, when it shares attributes with so many other game genres. Is there a rigid set of criteria that says the game can only stick to the tools offered in Symphony of the Night? Or is it an immersion property that comes out of design principles that are more abstract than these specific tools? Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be a conversation that the internet is yet equipped to handle, because the language is just too flimsy right now. For example, we all know the lore about Reddit mods. I believe the saying goes, the only time Reddit mods will have someone else's saliva touch their face is long after they're dead and their cats begin to eat it. And staying true to form, that's about what we see on the Metroidvania subreddit, where instead of offering reasoning behind why Dark Souls isn't a Metroidvania, the mods created a bot that will simply assert that it isn't every time it picks up on someone's comment saying otherwise. No need to have a conversation about it. The sweaty mods on Reddit have already spoken. But for those of us who aren't sweaty, lonely, and just impossibly sad, it's worth digging into this topic to actually have a thoughtful conversation about it. And I think I know why it's at least a little bit controversial. From what I can tell, it seems the comparison first came from the legendary Yahtzee in 2014, who said this.
I'd say the turning point was some ways in when I thought, maybe I'll try this boss again, or maybe I'll explore the 3 other areas that opened up after I frangled the sacred vest of Saint Bumnose. And then it hit me, that's Symphony of the Night thinking. And I love Symphony of the Night, but no non-2D games have captured the essence of Metroidvania, I'd argue, since Metroid Prime.
And I get why some people might see this as a flimsy comparison based on the language. After all, tons of games let you go to new areas in a different order if you run into difficulty spikes. This is true of Mega Man as is true of Skyrim. And while I agree with the Yahtzee here, I feel like this soft definition changes this from a clear criteria to an I know it when I see it kind of criteria. This leads to the attempted internet takedowns I'm talking about. Some of these arguments are silly on their face and have nothing more than arbitrary requirements. One such example I've heard is Dark Souls doesn't have any keys that unlock more than one door, and therefore it's not a Metroidvania. And that's of course not true because the Lord Vessel unlocks 3 doors, you're just not holding a key directly up to the fog wall. Checkmate, atheists. And the rest of the arguments seem to miss the forest for the trees. One argument demands that Metroidvanias have abilities in them that act as keys rather than being physical keys. Dark Souls only has physical keys and lacks the power-up keys, therefore it's not a Metroidvania. And while I'm sympathetic with this because I like getting new abilities that allow me to access new areas quite a lot, I don't think this argument appreciates the larger principle going on in Metroidvanias. Because the same principle is at work in Dark Souls as is at work in Super Metroid. After all, the reason it's so enjoyable to find new abilities that unlock new areas as opposed to finding random keys is because it's not only organic progression, this is progression that communicates players are opening up the world for themselves, rather than communicating the game is planning this on their behalf. And this has value. Just think about how the emotion changes if after beating a boss, a player finds a red key. The player will now remember that they saw some red doors earlier in the game. Now players feel as though they've completed enough of the game to allow them beyond a certain progress gate. The problem with this is it breaks the illusion the game is trying to create, because the game is outright telling you that this is the next step in the game. Now compare this with getting the grappling hook in Super Metroid. Players have to think about all the places they've seen in the game where they can now use this item. Once they do, they can now access this area that opens up even more of the game.
Yeah, that's kind of true. Just the fact that it's essentially a red door, but it's got a different skin on it. But to be fair, there is a bit of the actual physical mechanics of utilizing the grappling hook, which is kind of also interesting to consider in the discussion because it does change gameplay rather than just shooting a door. That's not as transformative gameplay to me. So I can see arguments for both, but generally I feel like Dark Souls has more of a spirit of a traditional Metroidvania than a lot of other games like Dark Souls. Not necessarily Dark Souls specifically, but the third person action adventure style game. I don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, Jube, nice to see you again, and Tyler, nice to have you in chat as well. Sweet Potato Dado has always preferred the Metroid side of Metroidvanias over the Castlevania side, if that makes sense. I'm the same way, and I think part of the reason why I'm not as big a fan of Castlevanias is because the character models have always felt really big and unwieldy to me, and I'm not a fan of the movement in those games. I want to like them. I've played a couple of them. I should go back and really give Symphony of a Night a try, as well as make maybe some of their more modern titles, but yeah. You do love several Castlevania games? Too bad they don't call Metroidvania games the Mega Mania games. So, man, there's this one game that I've been waiting to come out since I've been in college called Mega Man Corrupted. It's by this fan, or this solo dev / fan of the Mega Man games. That's kind of like Mega Man plus Metroid. It looks really interesting. But I at this point, I've been waiting probably over 12 years, so I just never expect it to get released. Yeah, that's true. A lot of upgrades in the Metroid games are only really used to open the doors, like the super bombs. Yeah, the little hamburgers. True story. Rondo of Blood is a good 2D Castlevania, but be warned, it's pretty hard. Okay. Thanks for the recommendation. Alright, going back to the video now.
Functionally, these two concepts are the same. They're both binary switches that allow players access to new parts of the game, but the difference is in the emotion they provide. With the physical key, players feel as though the world is a puzzle box that's meant to be opened, where one key is leveraged to gain another. A feeling that's amplified since the key is on the player's progress path. This is perceived as passive advancement. The game dictates where to go next. However, when they have progression through power-ups that allow them to act upon the world and overcome its challenges, players perceive this as active advancement. Players realize they might not be taking the route that this world had opened to its original inhabitants, but they brute forced their way by using this tool. In other words, while these are functionally identical, they're separated by what they communicate, and what they communicate is emotion. Because ultimately what players are understanding, in the version where power-ups act like keys, is they cannot rely on the larger game systems to tell them where to go, and so they feel stranded and alone. And the emotion captured in what I just described is the same kind of thing we see captured in Dark Souls. However, instead of a digital switch that gets turned from off to on when you find a new power-up, Dark Souls takes an analog approach. When starting out, you'll find there are plenty of regions on the map you can't yet visit, or else meet a swift death. These are the progress gates. But as you dial in higher stats for your character, upgrade your weapons, and find new spells and weapons, you're allowing yourself access to new regions of the map. you're still engaging with the game in the same way that you would in both Super Metroid and Dark Souls, and more importantly, you're getting the same kind of emotion as you would from the two different games. And what's more,
yeah, so Rain Transformed said they're genuinely afraid Mega Man X9 will come out before The Corrupted does, which would have been insane to say a decade ago. Yeah, I don't know about X9, but I did see that one like trailer for that like new Mega Man online game where like I think online is just kind of like a Mega Man phrase rather than like a literal online game where you could like play as like Vile and Sigma and a bunch of other random stuff. That one actually legitimately looked kind of interesting to me, which I kind of gave up on with the Mega Man series, to be honest. And not telling people the inputs for all the... Hold on, let me just... All the magic and special moves is whack, though. Oh, Symphony of the Night's the best. The shield dashing and the wing smashing can't be topped. You remember an old Reddit post talked about a player beating Pinwheel brand new? They didn't know the catacombs for later. I mean, that was almost the path that I took my first playthrough. But as soon as I saw the exploding skulls in the beginning area of the catacombs, like before this spot, I was just like, nope, I don't want to deal with this. And so I eventually trekked my way back up to Undeadburg. But then my second time playing through Dark Souls, I was like, no, I'm going to do it. And then I did kill Pinwheel at like level 13. All right, let's go back to the video. Is that actually a gacha game? It currently went offline? I didn't even know it was supposed to be up. I thought it could be a gacha game. I don't know. I'll need to look into it more.
is Dark Souls enhances this emotion, because even if you are more powerful after defeating the Belfry Gargoyles, you still don't know if you're ready to try the catacombs, meaning the lack of clarity on where to go next is that much more potent than in Super Metroid, because Super Metroid still has the slight suggestion for where players should go next based on visual cues. This is all to say, this binary approach to allowing access to new areas is an arbitrary requirement. Dark Souls' analog approach communicates the exact same feeling of being stranded and alone, as well or better than other Metroidvanias. And the last argument that I'll bring up is one that I also think misses the forest for the trees and seems to misunderstand the larger principles going on in genres that we talked about. It's the idea that if we allow Dark Souls to be considered a Metroidvania, we also have to consider other 3D games, or pseudo-3D games, like Resident Evil, to be a Metroidvania. While it's
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel, where you get like the slippery slope argument going on, where like after a while the distinctions between games become meaningless, and then you're just like left with like vague genre selections that just kind of don't mean anything. So from a certain point of view, it does make sense to have like more defined and more closed boundaries for genres, but nothing is ever really that simple as far as like games go. Because I remember back in the day, people arguing whether or not Zelda: A Link to the Past is an RPG or not, because you literally play the role of Link, you know. Whereas like most people nowadays would say, at the very least, it's an ARPG, like an action RPG. So if Dark Souls is a Metroidvania, does that mean like Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is a Metroidvania? Is it just an ARPG? Is Dark Souls just an ARPG? I mean, the answer is probably in the eye of the beholder.
It's very true that there's backtracking, keys to locked doors, exploration, and even save rooms that are removed from the dangers of the larger world. There's still something that makes this gameplay genre different from a Metroidvania that no amount of obtuseness can ignore. The fact that these are entirely different genres in more than name only. Like we've already discussed, Resident Evil is a survival horror game. Ammo is rationed and you have to choose your targets carefully. What's more is, once you kill an enemy, with some exceptions, they're gone forever. Meaning you are incentivized to kill enemies if you want to navigate the hallway safely. But the other side of the coin is, engaging with that enemy means you risk losing finite resources. In other words, the evaluation changes from a risk-reward proposition to a severe penalty, less severe penalty proposition. And this happens with almost every enemy, because the bullets, herbs, and first aid spray, and even enemy encounters are meant to be reconsidered when engaging with this game. The result of this, again, is a scary game that's full of tension as players doubt and reconsider their combat choices. And because the risk evaluation is so high when engaging with these enemies, the game is able to maintain tension, even in areas players have already explored. And so players are often tasked with with backtracking across the mansion several times over. And so when designing this game, the maps aren't nearly as large as you'd find in a Metroidvania, because there's tension if the game makes you backtrack, just as there's tension if the game has you encounter a new area. Now compare this to Dark Souls, and it's an entirely different game. You're never required to use finite resources for combat, and certainly never on an enemy-by-enemy basis like we saw with Resident Evil. Sure, you can run out of HP, and if you're a caster, you can run out of spells, but once you get to a bonfire, everything is replenished, including your healing items. In other words, this game is filled with short-term gambles, but unlike Resident Evil, that's creating a need to risk assess in every interaction you have with the numerous enemies. There is no long-term penalty that's making you evaluate if you will engage at all with them. And that's simply because there are no combat gambles that threaten to punish you until the end of the game. And that means players engage with this game in an entirely different way. Most enemies respawn at every bonfire, and so
Yeah, and so part of the way I could see somebody successfully make the argument that Dark Souls shouldn't be considered a Metroidvania is because technically all of the upgrades are like non-mandatory, which is a little bit silly, but kind of true. Like you could beat the game like fistless or just with your fists at level 1 and only picking up the most basic keys to get to where you want to go next. Or you could, wrong warp and deal with the consequences of those actions. All right, Drew, you take care. You have a good night. You think it's reductive to pigeonhole a lot of games like that? You think the music community has a very similar problem? I don't know. Like, the music, it depends what you mean, like, by pigeonhole, just because, like, there's so many genres of music, technically speaking, that they kind of lose their impact and just kind of end up sounding more like noise, not in like a literal like noise, like a music sense, but just like if you look up like the genres of rock, there's just so many random ones that just don't really mean anything to most like average consumers of music. So I'm trying to think of like some examples that are like more out there. I can't. Okay, no. Metal is probably a bit easier for me to talk about. So like thrash metal, black metal, death metal, metalcore, cuddlecore. Like after a while, screamo. Like what exactly is the difference between like? Yeah, never mind. I don't want to talk about like the actual specifics and like get people like, well, this is this specific. But I mean, I feel like you guys are picking up what I'm putting down. Butt rock, yeah, I forgot about that. You'd have to argue that the entire Arkham series are Metroidvania games instead of just Asylum, since they're Riddler trophies that can only be gotten with later upgrades. Yeah. This band is a post-black metal shoegaze fusion band. Honestly, like I recently encountered like a grunge shoegaze band, and that kind of like blew my mind because I was like, this is grunge, but this is shoegaze, but it kind of works. And I just like actually never heard a fusion of those like two genres together. And like obviously like My Bloody Valentine is sort of like that, but it's not like grunge like 90s era style grunge. Like they kind of sound like Soundgarden, but like with more of a wall of music. It's kind of weird. Yeah, music discussion. What band we talking about? So the one that I'm speaking of right now that I've really gotten into is called Soft Cult. One word, I'll type it into chat. So, a little bit of protag lore. I honestly don't like to talk about music too much because it feels like way too subjective for me to like really engage with others about it. Oh, you love that band? You heard of them? That's awesome. Yeah. Because they're not very popular on YouTube. Like, most of their videos are, like, 40 to 50,000 views. So, yeah, I've really been binging them lately. Isn't there still a massive debate in the music community on whether genres are even a real thing or just a marketing term? Yeah, I also like King Gizzard and Lizard Wizard. I like a lot of music. Yeah, so there's certainly truth to it, but I feel like you can get a lot of value from just having like really big genres, which encompass a wide variety of music. And then like the fans of that big genre can kind of quibble over like the details. So for me, like if I hear rock, I know what rock is. I have a very good picture of it. If I hear metal, it's kind of like Rock, but it's different. You know, I'm expecting something typically with like either like a heavier riffs, heavier distortion, either that or like faster pace. Like anyway, moving beyond that versus something like R&B, hip hop, and rap. Like those are all very similar in some ways, but very different in like how they actually express themselves. So yeah. Okay, so that's enough about that for now. Thanks for getting into the discussion. It's really fun. Yeah, country and western are outlaw, you know, that kind of stuff. Proto-draconic, apocalypse, power metal, yeah, all that kind of stuff. All right, let's go back to the video.
Players have an infinite method to deal with these enemies. What's more is players are highly incentivized to kill every enemy on their path, unless the enemies are too low level for players to worry about, or players have explored these areas already. And when players are killing most or every enemy without concern for long-term penalties, and on the contrary they're looking for long-term rewards, it means they're having a wholly different experience from survival horror. We might die in our attempts to reach the next save point. We might run out of spells too, but we aren't forced, nor do we risk being forced, to use rare items that we have no idea if or when will be replaced in order to reach the next save point. And so we engage with combat freely in the same way we do with any Metroidvania, which is to say, wholly different from how we engage with survival horror. But what's more is this doesn't only affect how players interact with each game. The difference in gameplay genres affects everything about the game, including how it's designed. Because there isn't nearly as much tension and backtracking, this means the maps sprawl outwards, with branching paths that contain their own branching paths. In other words, these aren't arbitrary requirements I'm urging be considered. The distinction I'm addressing here is the distinction between core gameplay loops that
I'm going to say this map is cool as hell. I wish I had the program or whatnot just to kind of view it. I mean, I say that, I'm just kind of like exaggerating because I'd probably like look at it once and then never forget, like never think about it again. But just looking at it like in this context is super cool.
Influences everything right down to the map design. And this is no small thing, because the core gameplay loop is the main interaction players will have with each game. While the map ticks so many of the boxes we recognize in Metroidvanias, that's simply not all there is to it. There's more going on in both these genres that don't only impact how players will engage with the enemy, it impacts the design of the maps as well. And with that established, I want to say that Dark Souls isn't just a Metroidvania, it's the Metroidvania. All the game design concepts that evoke emotion that I talked about before are present here. The branching paths that mean players are making choices, the far apart save points that make players feel exhausted when finding this point of rest, hidden save points and illusionary walls that make exploration meaningful and rewarding. Its hands-off approach that makes discovery of the world overwhelmingly up to players, and the fact it's littered with strategically placed treasures. All of this encourages exploration. That is, exploration as a mechanic that both demands choices from players, and it's done in a way where players associate tangible risk with those choices. This is why it's important to understand that Dark Souls is a Metroidvania, because what it knowingly adds to the mechanics also adds to the already present emotion of the genre. For instance, Demon's Souls invented the precise combat that the series is known for, so much so it created the genre of Souls-like. This makes combat brutal, visceral, and extraordinarily high stakes, making it so there's a sense of desperation as we locate the next save point, and respite once we do. It added the mechanic of only getting one chance to recover your experience points if you die, thus making it so there's an escalated sense of tension that goes beyond just starting over again. It added the brilliant replenishable healing mechanic that makes save points that much more valuable, meaning players see this as an actual point of rest, rather than just an advancement in progress. It also made traveling back to a save point in the middle of a region a limited resource, thus making it feel like there's a forward pressure until you reach the next save point or beat the next boss. This is all stuff I'm thrilled to see other Metroidvanias adopting since Dark Souls' release, because it amplifies the emotion that's already present in the gameplay genre. Just about everything the game added seemed to be created in order to enhance that emotion that was already...
Yeah, and I feel like for a lot of the good stuff that Dark Souls 1 did, Dark Souls 3, while being a really, really good action game, takes a lot of steps away from Dark Souls 1 by streamlining it perhaps a little bit too much, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, because it's better for casuals to get them into the genre, but it's also bad because I feel like you really do lose out on a lot of the mystique and the pressure of the original DS1, which somebody was talking about in chat earlier, which I agreed with, but just didn't read out loud. And even though the later games do certain things better, Demon's Souls is so immersive. Yeah, I don't know, because like Demon Souls does have a lot of good stuff going on for it. I really like its level design quite a bit, which surprised me. But it's just a little bit too bare bones for me. Like, I feel like I get the general idea of what they were going for, but it just didn't quite fully land for me. But to be fair, I did only play the remaster, or the remake, and not the original. There's a lot of fake difficulty in Demon Souls through Bloodborne due to those games' bad lock-on, especially DS2. Yeah, DS2 was really bad. You love Dark Souls 3, but it's the worst RPG of the series. I feel like the biggest issue with Bloodborne was its economy and having the blood vials be completely tied to like either farming them or purchasing them, which was really bad, as well as like having the atrocious load times that went along with it. Like if you fixed those two things, a lot more people would be on board with the series, even if they only had like 5 vials or like some upgrade in the dream to like be able to contain more blood with their vials and something like along those lines, or like maybe the blood becomes more effective to you the more like a pseudo vampire you become. Yeah, that's why I go blood tinge, shoot everything and take no damage. That only works if you actually know how to use blood tinge and like where to get stuff. That's kind of the issue with like a lot of these games on a first playthrough. Corporate says, to just add their 2 cents about the genres, all mainstream music genres are technically popular music as opposed to classical/jazz or any other broad overarching genre. Other big genres like alternative rock and R&B are made to organize radio station playlist formats. It's technically popular music. Yeah, I could see where you're going for with that. I feel like it is a little bit more nuanced, but I get what you're saying there. Be right back. I need to go ahead and ban Scowl Easy real quick.
Be present in the gameplay genre, and it led to one of the
most
you're
saying blood tinge, blood cringe.
And remember, when
my
a
fault.
Metroidvania is able to understand the emotion it's communicating through the gameplay genre, it can take advantage of this to amplify the emotions you're meant to feel from the narrative genre. Dark Souls has a narrative genre of dark fantasy and the themes of a lone knight who's destined to rekindle a flame in a dying world. And all the emotions from the story it's telling about the player character, the loneliness and fatigue, the curiosity and drive to move forward, the exhaustion and respite, all of it is expertly communicated through the gameplay genre, just as it's communicated through the narrative genre. Because the emotion provided by the narrative genre of dark fantasy, where players control a character whose importance is infinitesimal in a land of gods, is present throughout the game. And the gameplay genres of Metroidvania and Souls games amplifies these emotions. Now players feel minuscule and impotent against the threats of this world through almost every interaction they have in the gameplay, and the resulting emotions are plentiful. And this, unfortunately, brings me to Elden Ring, a game that has the same narrative genre of dark fantasy and similar narrative themes of a lone knight who sets out to restore order to the land. But ultimately, its change in gameplay genre from Metroidvania to open world makes this emotion less potent, if present at all. Elden Ring is a phenomenal game, and I don't want to discount its genuine successes. It really shouldn't be the gold standard for what open world games are from here on out. And it made me realize that I really can like these games when they're not cluttering my HUD with task lists. The world has strong visual language that's largely good about piquing my interests. And when it was able to accomplish that, I discovered new content, a reward, or at the very least, an interesting fight. It was full of attractive landscapes that begged to be journeyed, and had the Souls combat we all love and expect from the developer. On top of that, you got your save points, you got your backtracking, your branching paths.
Man, honestly, I was so excited when I saw like the Reduvia, because it was just very unexpected for them to kind of include that in the game, to have like the Bloodblade work that way. And I was so excited that there were going to be a hell of a lot more weapons like that, not like in terms of like the blood thing, but just like kind of subverting a lot of what you would have expected from their previous games. But that was kind of like one of the very few more unique weapons that they included into Elden Ring compared to like previous titles, relatively speaking, in terms of like the weapon art, like functionality and stuff. But anyway,
expect from the developer. On top of that, you got your save points, you got your backtracking, your branching paths that lead to visually striking areas, and you even have your dungeons that are basically the traditional Souls experience with a much more linear design. What I'm trying to say is, for an open world game, this game often makes me feel much like I did with Dark Souls. And this isn't entirely surprising. After all, it's true open world games have a lot in common with Metroidvanias. In fact, before there was such a term as Metroidvania, and Koji Igarashi was coming up with the idea of Symphony of the Night, the game that's the reason Castlevania is portmanteaued into the genre title, his original idea was to make Zelda, but still Castlevania. And so I can understand why some might see Metroidvanias as equivalent to an open world game like this, including the creators of Elden Ring, who seem to think the next logical step for the series was Zelda, but still Dark Souls. But just like we saw with the Resident Evil comparison, game genres can appear to have a lot in common with each other, but still offer entirely different emotions. Because what comes with an open world game is an entirely different feeling from that of a Metroidvania. And as we're going to see, that's because the open world comes with its own set of mechanics, and those mechanics are going to make the risk component of exploration as a mechanic disappear. Let's start by comparing how we navigate each different map. Gone is the
So yeah, Rain transformed, or no, it wasn't. It was Jube. Jube asked if I meant like more weapons like Rivers of Blood. While Rivers is cool, Reduvia felt something like alien to the genre, I guess I should say, because of just like it being a very small, compact weapon that looked more like the backbone of an alien or something, and then you would shoot like blood from it, with it coming from like this dude who comes out of nowhere to attack you. It just seemed like very evocative of like a different kind of fantasy world than like Dark Souls, just because we didn't really have a lot of stuff like that specifically. So I'm trying to think of like another really cool Elden Ring weapon. Obviously, like some of the gravity stuff was really cool, but it just didn't have the same kind of allure to me that the Reduvia initially had. Like nothing really compared to that experience in terms of like finding weapons, with the exception of like first being teleported to Caelid and actually like going out of the crystal cave to seeing like the red sky over the landscape that is just filled with like fungi that literally looked like an alien world to me. Like that's kind of what the Reduvia felt like in terms of like weapons. You were kidding? I'm going to answer, your fake questions literally. You guys know this about me. I answer rhetorical questions, even if I think you're kidding. Blood vials are over-criticized. Well, the issue is, like, blood vials aren't going to be an issue for people who know what they're doing, and so they just kind of unduly punish lower skilled players. Alright, I'm gonna go back to the video.
Intricate labyrinth that connected all these disparate parts of the map, where players felt like they were embarking on a journey to a new niche part of the wilderness when setting out. Here they'd have to battle strange enemies that guard the path, all while paying careful attention for shortcuts, loopbacks, treasures, or bonfires to save their progress. But in Elden Ring, players have an overworld that, while beautiful and retains a lot of the three-dimensionality to the topography that Dark Souls has, players can largely skip it. They can blow by it on their horse, or they can sneak past enemies avoiding their patrol path. The game tries to compensate for this by making attractions more eye-catching, so players aren't just beelining past everything. And the trade-off is, we can now find some of these hidden areas, but we have to walk behind this slow asshole and think about what's missing in this shift. Because whether we notice it or not, this affects a lot about how we emotionally digest this game. For starters, there's no longer the risk that we accidentally find ourselves stuck beyond the limits of a progress gate, like we could if we weren't careful in Dark Souls, because the deeper players got into a region, the more the game was autosaving, meaning there was a ratchet effect constantly engaging no matter where players were. Now players had to either go deeper into the dungeon, or claw their way out by reversing their path. While it's true players could use a homeward bone to teleport back to the last save point, players would eventually be confronted with a choice when they make it to the next save point. If players chose to rest at this bonfire, they would be stuck until they made their own way out. This feeling of anxiety and second-guessing your exploration choices is always present when players are making a choice when deciding what road they will go down. And after they have committed to a certain road, players will still be evaluating whether or not they can handle these enemies. Because the later they are when making that decision, the harder the game will be if they made a mistake. Because, again, the game will punish them for it. And even if the game doesn't really pull this trick where players get themselves stuck in the wrong neighborhood all that often, what matters is the game establishes that threat from the beginning of the game. Because this is what establishes the risk in players' choices. But this awareness of the risk is not so in Elden Ring. Players might stumble across a region like Caelid and decide they want to test their boundaries, but players never feel as though they might get stuck because the game systems clearly communicate to players that they can be exploited.
He's mostly right about this here, with the exception of if you go into like a catacomb or a like mine area, anything like underground, you can't fast travel out until you kill the boss, or obviously if you use like the memory of grace to return to the last grace point. So the only time you could like fast travel is either kill the boss, walk out of the dungeon, and that's pretty much it. So if you do manage to get teleported to Caelid through the box in the Dragon Burnt Ruins, you can't just immediately fast travel out, but generally he is right. Like 90%, if not higher, of the game, you're not going to be in that kind of a ever-present looming danger, which is probably better for like the newer players. So that's just kind of like one of those things where they streamlined a lot of the game and just to make it friendly. But I do kind of agree that typically you're not going to find yourself in a place where you shouldn't belong. And if you do, it's pretty obvious that it's kind of overscaling you. So when you first go to the Dragon Barrow, like it's such a different experience from the rest of Caelid. It just doesn't make sense with like how much stronger the enemies are there. Because like I was like level 40 when I first went up there, where like everything else in Caelid was fine. Then I went up to the north, and then all of a sudden, like, I'm struggling against dragons, and like even the pygmy dudes can be kind of tough if they like gang up on you if you go from like the front way rather than like teleporting in the back way. Or good luck to anybody who actually pisses off the Valiant Gargoyle, or Blackblade Kindred rather, right outside of the Bestial Sanctum. Yeah, it's also really hard to make stealth in open world games work. I think they do a pretty good job in Elden Ring, because although I liked a lot of the stealth in Sekiro, it became way too easy to cheese, and it was really boring to piss off everything and then like wait 5 minutes for things to calm down and everybody around the area to forget about like their dead companions. To be fair, Elden Ring still has some of those issues though. You're not sure why Elden Ring is worse there? Do you want to elaborate, Beans and Rice? Gotta use the stealth talisman and spells. Darkness incantation can break aggro mid-fight. True. I typically like to use Crepus's Vial, also just because it's nice to not have like the armor clink around with every step you take. Metal Gear Solid 5 makes open world stealth work, although more so because of the strength of its machines rather than anything special about the world. Okay. Oh, your point was just above it? It looks like it got eaten in chat. Oh, okay, no, I see it. Oh, the theme of all these games is to exploit the enemies for souls and loot. To an extent, yes. At least in Demon Souls, there was a little bit more like gimmicks where you could interact with the areas a bit more, at least with like certain bosses and whatnot, to exploit the enemies, but yeah, they could certainly add in more gimmicks and stuff like that to kind of make the worlds feel a little bit more lively. But I feel like Elden Ring's weaknesses are just like the lack of different content between each continent. So like if you shrunk each, subsection of the map by like 20%, the game might actually be a little bit better off, even if it was smaller. That's why you say they're like Mega Man, because you just exploit the enemies. True. All right, going back to the video.
Open areas combined with the fact that Torrent can run faster than enemies means players can control this entire region with little consequence. What's more is, because this is an open world game and players can warp between save points at any given time, there's no point of consideration on whether or not they will save the game, and that's because there are no negative consequences for that action. If anything, players are more eager to find a save point simply because they want to lose aggro or chart on the map where they got to in this forbidden region. And this changes the entire equation from what I was talking about in Dark Souls. That exploration that requires risk and choice evaporates, and that means so too does the emotion evaporate, because, well, this becomes completion rather than exploration. Players can now simply beeline it to the next save point if they decide they're in too deep, and they can warp back to an area they recognize once they do find that save point. And in fairness,
so I kind of disagree about the completion versus exploration. I think there is kind of a kernel of truth in what they say, though, in that when you find each side of grace, that adds to your map, so you're just kind of like checking it off. But I kind of explored incidentally and just, managed to find most sites of grace as I was doing that. So I was still very incentivized to explore, but I think what they're trying to talk about here is there wasn't enough risk in exploration to make the sites of grace feel as good to them as it felt to get like a bonfire in Dark Souls 1, which I can understand and sympathize with.
Fairness, Elden Ring tries to recreate this feeling that players are on a one-way street by making it so when players enter an optional dungeon, they can no longer warp out of it until they beat the boss. Trouble is, these optional areas are usually so small, the save point is at the entrance, and so all players have to do to exploit the game systems is walk out of the entrance that leads them out of the dungeon if they decide they're not ready for this particular challenge. And so there is no ratchet effect where players realize they're getting themselves deeper into a dungeon and they can feel that pressure. Players are simply adding options for what they can do to their itineraries, because once they're out of a dungeon, they can warp back in at any time. And this idea of the player taking advantage of the game's systems rather than tapping into their exploration instincts is a larger theme of why Elden Ring isn't as emotionally potent as it would be if it was a Metroidvania, because another aspect that the open world affects is how players decide to deal with the enemies of this world. Because in Souls games, I'd want to kill almost every enemy in my path. The downside of not doing this was having them chase me into an area where there was potentially a locked door, more enemies, or something else that would slow me down and cause me to succumb to the group. But in the big wide open overworld, there's very little need to fight most of these enemies. Sure, they might drop cool things, but not necessarily. And even if they're guarding something important, that doesn't mean players have to defeat them in order to get a reward. In fact, it's so easy to just yoink something in front of an enemy's face that it's practically incentivized. This is all to say that you can skip a surprising amount of this content, and the cost of which means we aren't really exploring anymore, at least not to the fullest extent of the definition. Players might...
I feel like this, I agree with him for a lot of this, but I feel like Elden Ring feels emptier the more you play it, because you realize how much of this content is kind of like optional and doesn't actually contribute to your success going through the game world. And because everything is so spread out, it becomes tedious to get the things that you want to incorporate to your final build for your second or third or fourth playthrough, because you're just kind of going down the checklist of, oh, I need to get X amount of golden seeds, I need to get X amount of like a flask of wondrous physic tears or divine tears, whatever they're called, the sacred blessing things. I need to get this crystal tier, I need to get that crystal tier, I need to get these spells, so I need to hit this part of this continent, this part of this continent, rather than it kind of coming up a bit more organically in play. And what I mean by like organically, it's like the kind of flow of going from point A to point B to point C, and then maybe from point C to point B to point D, that kind of thing that was more present in Dark Souls 1. So I do kind of agree with a lot of what he's saying here, but I feel like it's just a different flavor of exploration. And as he's saying, like, there's a lot less emotional investment in it, I can agree with that. And the other thing that I wanted to bring up with that is I thought it was extremely disappointing, it was really disappointing for me that there's essentially literally no incentive to play through any other time of day than night in Elden Ring. Why do I say that? It's because the only optional bosses appear at night. The only optional events really appear at night in terms of like the Erd Tree shedding its leaves so you get extra runes. So, sure, demi-humans become a little bit more aggressive, but nothing else really changes. So it's not like you're really penalized for going out at night. I guess the bats fly around a bit more, but it's not like the enemies become like way more aggressive like in Final Fantasy 15 or something like that. Do you agree that the suspense of exploration is lost with fast travel? Yeah. FromSoft making more gimmicks would be fine if they were consistently good at them, but then they come out with stuff like Mikolash or the Bed of Chaos, making you wish they would stick to their strengths. That's a fair criticism there. Well, we're touching on the Sites of Lost Grace. Do we have more lore on them aside from the mechanic? Is it literally where other Tarnished lost their grace after returning to the Lands Between? Not necessarily. It's supposed to be the memory of lost grace, and so like your guidance guides you there. There's not a lot. They're just bonfires, but golden skinned. You're not sure you'd classify being able to get things without fighting enemies as bad design. Stealth was implemented for a reason, and rewarding people for using it seems fair to you. That's true, but I understand what you're saying, and I agree to a large extent. However, what I'm trying to think, or what I think SolePorpoise here is saying is that it doesn't hold the same amount of tension as the previous games, which is something that they're lamenting as they're saying, like, their farewell, the goodbye to the Souls games because of Elden Ring and, like, the design philosophy changes of FromSoft in general now. You kind of agree, but you just played through your 5th dungeon, and it was fun to see how much you could be goof on dungeons with your new build. Yeah. So are you going through like all of the dungeons, or I'm not entirely following you? Are you saying like it's tedious to go through and do every dungeon, or that you still enjoy like exploring with like different builds in mind? Gimmicks do become very boring once you know what to do, and without running Mikolash, it's just a normal hunter NPC with an enlarged health bar. I think there's like levels to it, like trying to think of decent gimmick bosses. I mean, it doesn't have to be a gimmick boss as much as just like having more gimmicks in FromSoft games. So I think Dark Souls 2 is ironically both a good and terrible example of this, where they kind of incorporated a lot of gimmicks, which I really thought were cool. They just kind of sucked in how they implemented them. So having the really dark areas and being able to light them up with torches, I think is really cool. There's just not a whole lot of rewards to go along with it. Well, I mean, there kind of are, but it was just kind of unnecessarily punishing for people who don't have a lot of torches to begin with. So it's only really relevant at the beginning of the game, and then it just becomes like irrelevant later on when you have like 30 or 40 torches. So it doesn't matter if you waste 20 minutes doing dishes or something. Bring back the antidote in the BDSM tree. You like having to run after Mikolash and chase him because it makes it more fun for you? You heard the minority opinion? Yeah. So yeah, going back to DS2 with like their weird mechanics that they could have included as like gimmicks in their other games is how like when you go to Lost Bastille, there'll be the dudes that roll down the barrels that'll explode, or you could potentially like shoot barrels to make things explode, like in Bloodborne. Like Jura can inadvertently make barrels explode and kill the beasts in Old Yarnum. So or yeah, if you go to Old Yarnum and you go to the chapel with like all the praying beasts, if you knock down the oil urns from the top of the chapel, they'll explode at the bottom and set that church on fire. So if they had more gimmicks like that, but they also incorporated stuff like that into the open world, that could have been a cool thing to do. Or Dark Souls 3, you had like the one bridge kind of after Karthus Catacombs going into a High Lord Volnir's boss fight, where you could have like the 40 skeletons chase you across the bridge, break it from the other side, and they'll all like fall down into that pit with Hodrick. Like those are some of the really cool gimmicks that they have, but they're kind of like one and done things, which is good, but a lot of their level designs don't make that kind of experience a bit more accessible, perhaps. Yeah, Lights and Sinners Rise. So like they do have some of these things, but they could potentially incorporate more, which is a lot easier said than done, because then like if you do too many gimmicks, it feels like the entire game is just filled with gimmicks, and it makes things a little bit less accessible, perhaps. But I think if you like went to a place like Stormvale, if you had stuff to like knock off of the top of the roofs to like hit people down below, that could be a cool thing to do. But maybe then you would want to do something like to help out melee players if they like ran in face first or something. But I guess that's what, I don't know, like Spirit Ashes, or like if you could kite enemies into like the flame barrels or traps. Those are kind of other cool gimmicks. Like in the catacombs when they have like the dropping blades, you can guide skeletons into those blades. Stuff like that feels really cool, even if it's like not like groundbreaking. Hey Jay Dixon, welcome back to the stream. Yeah, the Frenzy Brain, that is a gimmick. It was kind of annoying, but it does set up a lot of tension in the Nightmare of Mensis. Replace every enemy in Stormvale with grafted Scions. No, just replace them with Sword Saint Ishin from Sekiro.
Might be driven by their own choices here, but there's really not much risk that comes with those choices. And what's worse is players don't associate risk with those choices. It's a relationship of picking and choosing what you want to complete a la carte versus feeling a constant sense of self-doubt as you yearn for the next save point in your journey. And on the subject of save points, there's an entirely different relationship between them and players in Elden Ring. In Dark Souls or many Metroidvanias, you don't see save points as a shortcut, only activated to come back to them once you unlock them. Instead, it was an oasis in a desert, a place of respite where you can rest after journeying through hell and barely making it. It wasn't always true, but when it was, it made for some of the most memorable moments in my gaming experience. And there's a formula in how that feeling is accomplished. The distance between save points, the difficulty of those enemies on the paths, the branching paths that will either lead you closer to a save point or take you further away from them, the paths that lead towards dead ends but have items at the end, all of this will factor into how stressful it is for a player before they feel that feeling of accomplishment and relief when seeing the familiar colors they now associate with rest. Altogether.
So yeah, speaking of like Elden Ring and its level design in the open world, they could have certainly incorporated more features to slow down the player or funnel them into one direction that was filled with enemies to kind of build up tensions at strategic points. So I think probably one of the best areas to kind of talk about that, even though it's kind of inconsequential in the grander scheme of things, is the first gate to Stormvale, the one where like the troll is on top of the ruins and like drops down. It's got a gate and you're in between two cliffs, so it's a very straight, direct line going up to Stormvale. So if you use Torrent, you can definitely rush past it, which sucks. But if they had more areas where they just had an enemy that like would dampen the effects of like spirit summoning, that would have been a way to stop people from just running past with Torrent, although they could definitely do it on foot. But if they had that kind of thing in like the catacombs or something like that, sorry, let me rephrase that. If you had like catacombs connect from one area to another part of that area, so it was like a tunnel underneath ground, that would be another way to like allow a certain kind of exploration, but contain it and confine it in such a way that it was harder to just completely move around it. So let's say, this is a really arbitrary example and it doesn't really have to mean anything, but let's say you took like the Black Knife Catacombs on Eastern Liurnia, but you had it connect into Raya Lucaria or something like that. Or even if you took the catacombs, or not catacombs, like the mines underneath Raya Lucaria, where you would go get like Terra Magica, but you were able to go back into the school directly through that route. That could be another way to kind of incorporate that stuff. Although maybe it's not fair to attach it into like a legacy dungeon directly. So, or let's say going through, there's a really good example with the Ruin-Strewn Precipice. So that's kind of one access point from Liurnia into Altus Plateau. That's not the Lift of Dectus. And you do fight like a bunch of enemies going through there. It's not exactly the traditional legacy dungeon, but it kind of works that way. So if they had more stuff like that incorporated into the open world itself, like mountain paths where it's really narrow, so if you like move too far to the side, you could fall off to your death or something like that. They could have done more things for sure, which isn't to say like what they have now is bad, but I do agree with like a lot of what he's saying where it becomes kind of trivialized with the sort of ease of access we have to travel in Elden Ring. You like how several Remembrance bosses in Elden Ring have little gimmicks? Like Renala has her first phase, Radahn has multiple summons, Rykard Storm Ruler. Yeah, so there are some pretty good gimmicks in Elden Ring, just not so much for like the open world areas. The bonfires aren't fast travel argument only really holds up for Dark Souls 1 until you get fast travel, and then doesn't fit at all for any of the other games. Kind of true, but I think what he's saying is like what I was talking about with like the ease of travel. Like Dark Souls 2, you can't exactly run from one bonfire to the next. So that one's good, but Dark Souls 3 you can definitely run it and ignore everything. So that one isn't as good. But in Dark Souls 1, you could run past everything. So yeah, I don't know. Like, you could trivialize a lot of the games if you just try to run past them, except for like Dark Souls 2 and maybe Demon Souls. Yeah, DS2 has some of the worst runbacks in the series. Just imagine how much better DS2 would be if it had Stakes America, or how much worse. Who knows? Yeah, so yeah, as Sweet Potato Dado says, the fact that the bonfires were reliefs in Dark Souls 1 is kind of like his main argument as to why he doesn't like the design of Elden Ring, I think. You like the little puzzle with erudition? Reminds you of Show Your Humanity? Those could be good. Some of them weren't as good. Like, erudition was fine. It just wasn't very clear that it was supposed to be a gesture until you already had it, which is fine. But yeah, I did like a lot of the little mini puzzles with the rises. Some could have been better, though.
Together, it's exploration at its best, because it means players' choices are full of risk. But this exploration is not present in Elden Ring's overworld. Sure, the save points in Elden Ring are set up so they're just off the path that players will take, and sure, they allow us the chance to spend our experience and replenish our flasks. But with your ability to ride past enemies on this land, there really isn't that sense of risk and reward you get in a Metroidvania. And the difference again is in the emotion. Now save points in the overworld are just things you activate, not because you're craving that feeling of relief that comes with careful, stressful, and deliberate exploration, but rather you activate them so you have more options if you need to come back to an area via warping. And it's fair to point out that you'll eventually get the ability to warp in Dark Souls, but I think this misses the larger point I'm trying to make. There's a big difference between finding a save point on horseback and running over to activate it in case you need to access a nearby NPC later, and finding a save point that took everything out of you to reach it, and now you can rest and reap the rewards of your tenacity. Now, as many of you are probably furiously typing at me, it's of course true that save points in the dungeons act much in the same way as save points in Dark Souls, and that's to say exceptionally well for communicating emotion provided by the exploration. I felt a similar sense of relief when feeling I had nothing left to give even one more enemy, but instead of an enemy around the corner, I found a site of grace. It's a great feeling that I'm glad the game is occasionally able to capture, but unfortunately, this feeling wasn't complete, because as I've been saying, the open world comes with a new set of mechanics, and this new set of mechanics makes players feel like they're completing the game rather than exploring it. While the game retains many of the same combat mechanics, the game loses the forward pressure Dark Souls had because you can warp wherever you want at the touch of a button. Now players are just in a situation where if they fight an enemy beyond their skill or character level, they can simply warp to anywhere on the map they haven't yet done.
I understand where he's coming from with this, but I'm a little bit surprised that he's trying to blame it more on the abundance of the sites of grace, because I feel like that overlooks that the game isn't trying to put pressure on people to go into one direction as much as the goal of Elden Ring is to unbridle, or it's to like foster a sense of freedom. Like that was kind of like their end goal there. And why I don't think like Sites of Grace really fits into his argument is that in Elden Ring you actually get your flasks back from killing packs of enemies, which is a huge departure from the previous games in the catalog there.
Rewards of that area, only to just as effortlessly warp back to the most recent save point in the dungeon so they can try again, where they left off. Sure, players are making choices, but there's no risk associated with these choices, because if players decided they weren't ready for a particular challenge, they could simply scoop up their runes and try somewhere else. And players can distract themselves with all sorts of side stuff. That could be exploring one of the catacombs they haven't yet completed and getting those rewards, returning to a fort they haven't yet completed, fighting that boss at the Everjail, finishing that quest they didn't do yet, fighting that minor Erd tree they didn't beat yet, going back to the many caves they haven't completed yet. This isn't to say that Elden Ring is doing a bad thing by offering this many options that are only the result of the player's good eye, but the emotion it offers is completely different from what I'm describing in Dark Souls, and we need to be able to identify that. Gone is the feeling where we had to get good at a boss, or overcome the challenges of the region, or else be forced to fail somewhere else in the game that's of equal or greater challenge, and also in an entirely different section of the map, somewhere we'd have to take the time to walk there by foot with no guarantees that it would be any easier on us. Now we have a feeling we can pick and choose as we desire, where we go to extract slight advantages with relatively trivial challenge. And this really is the emotion, or lack thereof, I'm trying to identify, that comes with the open world game genre, when our exploration only comes as a result of us deciding there's probably something for us at the end of this cul-de-sac, but will only return if we decide we need some more runes to spend or a new trinket to equip. The game has ejected exploration as a mechanic from its formula. Maybe not entirely, but as far from what it was, where players felt every choice they made was coded in risk. After all,
the one thing that I'm thinking about with this right now is I kind of feel the same way about Sekiro as Elden Ring in terms of like its exploration in some ways. Like it's very similar to Dark Souls 3, but I wasn't nearly as relieved to get to like a extra. I forget what they're called. They're not Sites of Grace, obviously. I almost called them like Shinobi Vows, but they're definitely not that. Well, to the next save points, like it's nice to get to them, but because stealth was so prevalent in that game, you could really mitigate a lot of the risk traversing areas that weren't gated off by certain things. Sculptor's Idols, thank you. Yeah, that's definitely it. So, I'm not so sure it's fair to say goodbye to Souls games because of Elden Ring, because they kind of had the same issues going on since Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro. Even Bloodborne to like a smaller degree. Although Bloodborne felt a little bit better about it, just because you wanted to go back and buy more freaking blood vials, perhaps.
We're simply exploiting the game systems to take what we need when we need it, because we know what we're getting when we enter a catacomb, just as we roughly know what we're getting as we enter a cave, just as we know what we're getting when we fight a minor Erd tree. It's not always, but often, the same old thing. A boss at the end of the road who can either be defeated or not, and us deciding if we want to try somewhere else.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of my bigger criticisms about Elden Ring, is that on the first playthrough, all of this stuff is great, but as you become more familiar with the game, it gets worse and worse the more you play it, because it does become so much more formulaic, and you understand like how much stuff is kind of like filler content rather than like the whole like meat and bones style content that you'd get in Dark Souls 1 and even like Dark Souls 3, in my opinion.
And the result of this is, I just decided I would do these things as I wanted to do them, not because I was genuinely excited about seeing the world give way to my exploration. In the end, I could feel that difference. It's the difference that makes the world feel more like a theme park than a world that resists any decision we make. The price of admission for the spooky world's catacombs is finding the save point inside, and in order to be tall enough to ride Mr. Erdtree's wild ride is to have enough vitality so as to not get one-shotted. And if you change your mind, you can come back instantly when you're ready to, with no risk or penalty. It simply feels as though we're picking and choosing what we engage in for entertainment, just as we would at Disney World. And while it's entertaining, it's simply not all that emotional. I think one of the worst mistakes a critic can make is to assert something is bad, because it's not how they would have done it. The real goal of a critic should be to look at the goals of the work, and analyze whether it accomplished those goals and to what degree. And that's why I'm picking on Elden Ring at the moment. As I've said before, I love this game. It has hours upon hours of content that's fun, interesting, and rewarding. It has replayability where I genuinely can't wait to play all the different kinds of builds, something that's further encouraged by finding all the different items in the world that have nothing to do with my build, but look fun as hell to use. It has the combat I adore, and it has an awesome story supported by awesome lore. What's more is, it was so good at convincing players that their goals were their own, when in fact, there was a lot of audience manipulation going on. Something that's an infinitely superior system than a quest giver system that you'd see in almost any other open world game. In fact, it's so superior, it's almost an insult to compare the two, but here we are. There's so much here that's not just good, but great that I can't ignore or pretend like it has no value. But this doesn't change the fact that something's different here, and it's not a trivial thing. The emotion Dark Souls has is largely gone. All that we talked about that it added to Metroidvanias, from the strategically placed save points, to players feeling as though their choices will make or break them, to the intense combat, to the penalty for dying, ranges mostly or entirely undermined by the open world that simply doesn't synergize with the rest of these mechanics in the same way. And the additionally unfortunate thing is, it tells a story that would have benefited so much more from the gameplay genre the series helped perfect. A story about gods who struggled and fought over power, only to destroy the world in the process, and the player character that is only a knight who is now duty-bound to undo the chaos created by the gods.
And one other, whom grace would again bless. A tarnished of no renown, to stand before the Elden Ring and become the Elden Lord.
What better themes than these should the game make players feel? Through the gameplay, self-doubt about their decisions, which are numerous, making them exhausted between save points as difficult enemies tax their limited resources and skills, through making them stress that if they die, they risk losing much that they earned, as though they are at the mercy of the world that's hostile to them. Which is all to say, what Dark Souls benefited from in terms of emotion to tell its similar story, Elden Ring would have benefited from. And unfortunately, Elden Ring did not. Here, players largely took advantage.
So Rain Transformed says, they don't know. The first time wonders of exploration being worse don't seem like much of an issue when it was always a transient thing in comparison to the combat, which has only gotten better. I don't know. I do feel like exploration in Elden Ring in some ways is better than like Dark Souls to a degree, but I think the overall world building and presentation of Dark Souls 1 is a lot more cohesive than Elden Ring. And part of that is because the Dark Souls world forces you to engage with it, whereas Elden Ring treats itself as like more of a game than anything. So I think if I were to make like a weird comparison, there might be the potential in the future to have a game that's even better than Elden Ring made by like From Software. So the comparison that I would make is, if Elden Ring is to Dark Souls 3, could we get an Elden Ring 2 that is to like Dark Souls 1? Could we have an Elden Ring that is a lot less streamlined and a lot more punishing and still open world and encourages players to explore as fully as they want to? Potentially. I mean, it'd be really easy to space out like a lot of the sites of grace and stuff and funnel people more in like more specific directions, but just have more branching paths overall. One of my initial like super desires for a game like Elden Ring was to have the world evolve based on your actions as you go through it. So in my mind, before Elden Ring came out, I was like, oh man, like what would happen if, say, you fought one demigod, and because you fought that one demigod and killed it, another demigod killed another and like gained part of their powers. So depending on like what demigods you killed in what order, it would affect like the final battle, what powers that demigod had, all those kind of cool ideas. So there's like a lot of different directions they could go with the formula to really spruce things up and make it a bit more brutal. But I think they really wanted a more streamlined game, and it makes a hell of a lot more sense to make this game more streamlined for the broader audience, and it definitely paid off in droves. Like, it put them on the map, and like people are playing Armored Core now because they're like, oh man, From Software makes good games. Whereas like Armored Core was such a niche game for so long, like nobody like had even really heard of it who were like weren't big From Soft fans from back in the day. So yeah. And then you ask, couldn't he have turned off HUD in The Division? Wouldn't that fix his issue with the inferior system there? Yes and no, because turning off the HUD would probably include like turning off the HUD for all enemies and showing how many rounds you had left in your chamber. So it's a little bit of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, perhaps. You should try a no HUD run. You doubt you'd get far. For Elden Ring, specifically, it's really not that bad. I think Sekiro has the best HUD-less experience of all of the FromSoft games, and then Dark Souls 2 is probably the second best. Ironically enough, just because it gives you more indicators of like when you're low on HP. Like Shadow of Mordor? I haven't played Shadow of Mordor, but maybe. Maybe that's what Shadow of the Erdtree is all about. Man, we could huff on that copium all night long, huh? You've been wanting to play AC on PC for like 15 years, yeah. FromSoft is second only to Nintendo for their track record of good games. DS2 isn't even terrible compared to some of the awful recent games. Other awful recent games, I don't know. In some ways, I feel like FromSoft is a bit more reputable than Nintendo, but obviously, like, not for casuals. But like, you kind of know more or less what you're getting with FromSoft. Whereas like, there's kind of a bit of a range with Nintendo games. Like, let's be honest, not all of their Star Fox games are up to par. Mario is always fantastic. Don't get me wrong. Legend of Zelda is typically a really solid experience with a few misses here and there, like with Skyward Sword. Depends on your kind of personal preferences too. Eric William had never heard of Armored Core till recently. It's incredible, but you're stuck at Baltus. You were waiting for 12 on Thursday. Yeah, so I think they mean like Nintendo is like a first party platform, but yeah, they certainly do have like a lot of shovelware which gets licensed under that Nintendo label. Their total games past Demon Souls is like 7 games. Yeah, it's fair, and like Nintendo produces a lot more. But I mean, even Demon Souls, with as rough as it is kind of like I don't want to say like a diamond in the rough, but it's definitely, it's got a certain charm to it.
Of the game's systems that were meant to be taken advantage of. I'm under no illusions that what I'm saying here is going to influence FromSoft devs. I don't expect them to go back to their roots like Capcom did with Resident Evil 7, especially with how successful this game is compared to its predecessors, and the fact that with each Souls game, the mechanics seem to creep closer and closer to those of an open world game. And I'm not saying FromSoft even should listen to me. I love that so many new people were introduced to Souls games because of Elden Ring. The purpose of this video is to say that yes, the open world detracts from the overall experience, but what it detracts is something I'm not sure is all that well appreciated in the larger discourse, and that's the emotion the game is able to provide. And for that reason, I do feel the need to point this out for posterity. If not,
so yeah, one of the other things that I thought would be really cool, and this is something that I've wanted for an extremely long time in a video game, is kind of like an open world experience. However, if anybody's familiar with like the old Mega Man games, the Mega Man X series in particular, whenever you would kill one Maverick, the areas related to that Maverick would change, or like the other Mavericks in relation to that area boss being defeated would get affected. So like if you killed, trying to think of a good one. If you killed Launch Octopus, Sting Chameleon's area would get flooded with water. So if you had something like that going on with Elden Ring, where you could affect the world as you killed like bosses or like perform certain events other than like burning down the Erdtree, that could have been an S tier experience in terms of like having a transformative open world where like the traversal of like going to and collecting all the sites of grace could have been more important, or maybe like some certain sites of grace could get like washed out by floods or things along that line. Having different enemies in those areas get affected by the kind of changes. So maybe there's like a bunch more like land octopi, or the dreaded like not scorpions, what are they called? Like crayfish in areas where they didn't previously exist because there's more water for them to access. So that'd be one thing that I'd really like for an open world game like Elden Ring. X was a magnum opus of gameplay. Yeah, it's probably one of my absolute favorite Super Nintendo games. More dynamic world would be amazing for an open world game. That's something that I really, really, really wished they would have done with Pokemon a long time ago. Without Chill Penguin, the Flame Mammoth area had frozen parts. True, yeah. And so you could make levels more difficult for yourself if you fought them without those kind of handicaps, or you could make them easier, which is a really cool part of the Mega Man X games to me. Nothing cooler than returning to an early area that's now all messed up. Capital of Ash was a bit of a letdown. Yeah, it was basically empty. They could have done a bit more than having like the 3 ulcerated tree spirits and then like the entrance to the sewers open, and then like the one fight with the Valiant Gargoyle, or were there 2 total? Yeah, empty areas could be cool depending on how they're done. So I think one of the absolute coolest empty areas in a video game was in Super Metroid when Samus finally meets the Metroid, and as she's getting to that area, it looks like everything is just kind of like turning to sand and crumbling to dust. And that is such a good like environmental storytelling that's like, oh man, this place is not right. This is so different from everywhere else we've been. And then you find out like the cause of it is the little Metroid, and then it comes and attaches itself to Samus, and then it's like, oh wait a second, I know you. And then, you know, it's like the whole turning point of the end game there. So yeah, it can be done, but it just has to be done well.
Not for FromSoft devs, at the very least, the Souls-like creators, who are trying to understand what made Dark Souls as good as it was. What makes these games amazing isn't just the combat, or the exploration, or the Metroidvania genre, or the mythic story, it's how it all works together to create something more. And appreciating this fact really is at the core of what I'm getting at, to see other games take advantage of this idea of making the story and gameplay genres work together to create potent emotion. What I'm trying to say is, help us to Gasmison, or however you pronounce your name, you are our only hope. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring my bell. I'm really excited about what I've currently got cooking, and if you're also interested in critical analysis on gameplay and storytelling like this, I think you'll love what's to come. So make sure you're getting my notifications. It's also content you can actively participate in supporting financially as well by becoming a patron, a group of people I sincerely cannot thank enough. They're the reason I feel like I'm able to push my boundaries, create better, more meaningful content, and offer original research. I'd also like to personally thank Griffin116, Grant Vogel, Faisal Shaker, John O'Donnell, James Burgett, Aaron Potter, Master Ren 7, Azala, Hans Homan, Rexai, Charlie Hustle, Simon, Uyuyu, Joshua Tokarski, Jeremy Barnes, Jan Berenz, Sergio Proxy, Percival, and Drawzer. Thank you all so much as always, and I'll see you all next time.
So yeah, as you guys can imagine, I think that was a fantastic video. I obviously have a few disagreements here, as I do with pretty much everybody, which is perfectly fine. Very thought-provoking stuff, lots of really good discussion to come out of this, and it's great to kind of see these types of videos. So I also got recommended something else by SolePorpoise, but I haven't added it to the playlist yet. I'll need to like look back at what the recommendation was, because I'd be a little bit forgetful, because I think they have something else, either Elden Ring or like Bloodborne related, that got brought up to me. So yeah, this is my first video by them. It is really good. Hopefully you guys will give them a like and a sub yourselves. All right. Game has backtracking. Oh my god, is this a Metroidvania? Not saying that any of the vids tonight did this, just complaining about annoying people. Yeah. So I did really like this video. My only kind of minor complaints really would be I would have liked more tangible connections to other Metroidvanias than just the Jedi game that I can't remember its name, even though they just said it like 12 times in the video. So yeah, nonetheless, I really enjoyed this one. So that'll pretty much be it for me for tonight. Oh, I didn't like it. I thought I did. Go ahead and give them a like. If you guys would also be so kind as to oblige me and give me a like and or a sub, since apparently I've had people watching the streams daily without being subbed, that'd be super cool as well. But yeah, that'll be it for me tomorrow, or tonight even. I don't know what I'm going to watch tomorrow quite yet. I'm going to do some thinking and then post that stuff when I'm ready. So yeah, we will be going live again tomorrow at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as usual. So take care, stay safe, hope to see you next time. That'll be it from me. Last Protagonist out.